Today on Public Research.
You know, the lessons of Nazism are ultimately universal for all oppressed people and all people who can be victims of oppression and persecution. And I think that it's you know, the realities of Nazism and the horrors of the Holocaust and of imperialism more broadly and colonialism more broadly shows, you know, the necessity to overcome the capitalist imperialist world order and construct a system based on genuine equality of nations and genuine solidarity between all peoples.
Donald Parkinson returns to the show to make the case for anti-Zionism. We discuss the founding of Israel, lessons of the Holocaust, the war in Gaza, what makes a genocide, and prospects for coexistence in the Holy Land. I thought the best thing to do was maybe to lay out where I'm coming from. I don't like the settlements. I would get rid of all of them. We should have put sanctions on them 20 years ago.
Right.
My dream would be, I mean, if we could go back in a time machine and I could tell Ehud Barak, I would just been like, just be more generous. Okay? Go back,
Right.
offer Arafat more. And God knows, maybe we could be living in the 20th year of a Palestinian state or some form of a state by now.
Right.
For me, that's the dream. I'm not interested in settling Gaza, settling the West Bank. That's unimportant. As I've told you, I would prefer Israel be in Alaska, in an empty part of the Alaskan coast.
Right.
I'm not interested in the artifacts at all.
So you're coming from like a purely kind of liberal secular Zionist perspective, like, you know, more classic Ben Gurion, like, you know, labor Zionism.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it's important for people to think about a world without Israel when you discuss these issues. So I want to screen share this. This is from Ken Burns' documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. So this is right at the beginning of the Holocaust, and Jews are trying to escape Germany. This is obviously before 1948. There is no Israel. And here's how America reacted when they were asking to be let.
No group was more adamantly opposed to admitting Jewish refugees than the German-American Bund. 20,000 members would fill Madison Square Garden on Washington's birthday.
In body, mind, and soul, as any other non-Aryan, and that he is a... We only call upon our leaders to awake to the fact that the Jew is as alien in body, mind, and soul as any other non-Aryan, and that he is 1,000 times more dangerous to us than all the others by reason of his parasitic nature.
This is a classic American Nazi Party, German-American Bund.
Great floods of tears for a few 100,000 job-taking so-called poor Jewish refugees, who incidentally in general have more of this world's goods than you or I will ever possess.
A Fortune magazine poll found that only 1 in 10 respondents favored increasing quotas or making exemptions for refugees, and 4 out of 10 believed Jews had too much power in the United States.
They were blocked from coming in the U.S. And then after the war, I just wanted to play these two just to get context of why Israel was created and the situation. A lot of people don't know that after the Holocaust ended, a lot of the Jews in 1947 were still in the concentration camps. Did you know
Yeah,
that?
yeah, no, they were in the displaced camps
The
all throughout
DP
Europe.
camps, like Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah.
And so this is from a writer from the Times of Israel named Haviv Rediger on the Econ Talk podcast. Okay.
Concentration camps. So, for example, Bergen-Belsen is liberated as the Allies march eastward through Germany, unless you're an actual inmate of Bergen-Belsen, because you still couldn't leave 2 years later. So were you liberated? I don't want to take away from the Americans and the British the fact that the extermination was stopped. That is not a small thing, obviously. But the Jew in Bergen-Belsen is still in Bergen-Belsen in 1947. That is not what liberation looks like. And there are 250,000 of them. And Truman asks Congress to lift the quotas. Congress refuses again and again. 1945, 6, 7. Jewish groups beg Congress to do so in America. Christian groups come to Congress and beg Congress to lift the quotas. We're not talking about millions more Jews. There aren't millions more Jews. We're talking about these last vestiges of a decimated Jewish world, and nobody will take them in. When do the DP camps empty out? They empty out essentially at the founding of Israel in 1948, so much so that a huge proportion of the Israeli military in 1948 that fights that war of Israel's independence, probably a quarter, were DPs. Their experience of that war, their experience of this new Israel, leave aside, ideologies. We're not talking anything, nothing we have talked about here is ideologies. What's fascinating to me is not what tiny ideological elites, how they tell the story of what happened to their peoples. What fascinates me is to just literally trace the experience of the actual people themselves living through these periods. What does it mean for an IDF soldier to be an IDF soldier after 3 years in Bergen-Belsen, after Holocaust, after knowing that his parents and grandparents lived through 6 decades of what we just described? That's the founding of Israel.
And just finally, just to top it off, this clip from the book Rise and Kill First by Ronan Bergman.
The leader of the hit teams and commander of some of its operations was Nehemiah Meiri, a Holocaust survivor born to a traditional Jewish family in the village of Demblin in southern Poland. He was 12 years old when the Gestapo rounded up the Jews of his village and marched them into a nearby forest. The Jews were ordered to dig a pit and forced to line up along its edge. Then they were machine-gunned. Nehemiah, already a resourceful and strong boy, dived into the pit a split second before the order to open fire was given. The Germans did not notice, and he lay quietly among the corpses of his family and neighbors until the killing was over. When the Germans were gone, he crawled out of the mass grave, soaked in blood. Later in the war, after Meiri was captured and forced into hard labor at an airstrip, he saved the life of a senior Luftwaffe officer who crashed his Messerschmitt on the runway. Meiri climbed into the burning aircraft and rescued the unconscious pilot. After the war, he immigrated to Palestine on the famous illegal immigrant ship Exodus. He fought in the 1948 War of Independence and was taken prisoner.
So these are the people that created Israel. And I think you can say if you disagree with this, but I've seen Matt Leck say this comparison to the French in Algeria.
Right.
And to me, to compare this guy who entire family was wiped out in the Holocaust to some rich French guy who moves to Algeria because he can
Right.
get a bigger house it bothers me.
Well, there's a few things I want to address here,
Yeah.
which is, first of all, obviously the Holocaust and the fallout of the Judeo side and the Hitler crusade. Obviously there needed to be some kind of way to address not only the a massive amount of refugees, Jewish refugees specifically who were created, but also just the reality of anti-Semitism, of the persecution of the Jews. And if I was alive back then, I would probably have had the same stance now, which is that I generally think that there should be open borders. Like I generally think that I think that obviously this is a long-term goal, but regardless, I think a better solution to the reality of the Holocaust would be to create a new international refugee system to ensure that there was always, a refugee from any group that is being persecuted will always have a place to go. And I think there, you do have the kind of international human rights, establishment that's created as an attempt to kind of address this. But I think, the reality is that the state of Israel was, yes, a lot of the people who would come and participate in the founding were Holocaust survivors. But there had been a long period of
Yeah,
Zionist
yeah,
colonization in Palestine before the Holocaust, and they were very much determined to create a Jewish state in Palestine before the
right.
Holocaust had happened. Like, I think, Ben Gurion, I've been reading, a lot about the British Mandate era period. I mean, he very much saw the rise of the Nazis as an opportunity for the Zionist mission, bringing in more Jewish immigration. He had a very almost Machiavellian kind of approach to these things. Very, he was very hard-headed and dedicated to accomplishing his goal. So I think, you know, it's obviously true that the Holocaust, created this massive crisis that gave a lot of legitimacy to the idea of partitioning Palestine and allowing the creation of a Jewish state. But I do think you have to look at, a lot of the driving force behind the Zionist movement and the creation of Israel comes from a generation of settlers who had come in there, before the Holocaust survivors had arrived. And a lot of them were fleeing persecution in, Eastern Europe. Don't get me wrong. A lot of the Jews that came in as settlers were fleeing Tsarist anti-Semitism, or a lot of them were fleeing Ukraine after,
Right.
during the Russian Civil War, the White Army was going around pogroming Jews. So a lot of them were fleeing to Palestine. So,
What's interesting about this new debate among Jews about Zionism, anti-Zionism, is that this debate happened before,
right,
especially in Poland, and there were people. And since you bring up David Ben Gurion, he was one of the Zionists in Poland, and after these pogroms, he moved to the Holy Land. And there were the anti-Zionist Bundist Jews, who a lot of them were very brilliant people who left behind a
right,
lot of writing. Sadly, a lot of them died in the Holocaust.
right. And I mean, a lot of Jewish communists, who were critical of the Bundist, for example, because they thought the Bundists were too separatist, even. Like Lenin and Lenin wasn't Jewish, but like Trotsky, for example, was Jewish. Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, they thought the Bundists were kind of like identitarian, like too focused on their Jewish identity to the exclusion of class unity, kind of, and they had that perspective. So, you also have like the Jewish Marxist kind of perspective, which was, I guess, which is, the perspective I find myself agreeing with the most.
But what? Okay, so what is the lesson of the Holocaust?
Well, I think, I see the Holocaust as, in a way, the peak of European imperialism. I think it's, in a way, a kind of it's a culmination of, the rise of this modern imperialist, competition between these capitalist empires. And I see Nazi Germany as probably the most depraved and the most ideologically irrationalist and unhinged expression of, a broader trend in, the in capitalist societies. You have with the collapse of the feudal aristocracy in Europe and the rise of, the modern bourgeoisie. I think in World War I is when this really fully consolidates. And leading up to World War I, you have, the scramble for Africa, you have massive colonization efforts, and and I think the Holocaust in many ways is related to a broader. It's symptomatic of a broader crisis of European imperialism. And I think Germany is an example of just an extremely aggressive and unhinged form of imperialism. And I think the lesson of the Holocaust. I mean, there's obviously a lot of lessons, but
Yeah. So let me say what.
But that would be
Okay.
like more of like a historical
Mhm.
framework, how I would see it in the broader framework of things. I think, I see Nazism as a counter-revolution.
So many Jews would say the lesson of the Holocaust is that at the end of the day, Jews can't rely on other people to protect them.
Right, right.
They had no army, they had no place to go. Were just beg. All the Jews could do in America was just beg.
Right,
Please
but
let
that's not really true.
really.
Like, see, that's kind of, to me,
What
that
do you mean?
concedes, well, there's kind of, I'll hear, sometimes I'll hear, from like right-wing Christians, they'll say stuff like, "Oh, the Jews, why didn't they fight back against the Holocaust? They just let
Oh,
themselves."
I'm not saying I'm not that's not what I
Right,
meant.
but it's not necessarily true that Jews didn't do anything to fight back against the
No,
Nazis.
no,
Like a lot of them
that's not
joined the
what I meant.
partisans.
That's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. I meant um they didn't have an army, they didn't have a nation, they had no safe haven to go to. Um, there was no Israel for them to go to. There was no IDF to bomb Nazi ships or whatever. That's what
Right.
a lot of Jews take the lesson of the Holocaust to be. You think? What do you think about that?
Well, I think the lesson is generally just that, fascism needs to be defeated and stamped out. Like, and I see, in my opinion, we didn't really fully do that in World War II. I mean, obviously, like, if the kind of rehabilitation of a lot of the Nazis and stuff after the war, but I think, in my opinion, my answer is, listen, like, Nazism is a threat. Fascism, extremist nationalism, extreme reactionary exterminationist type ideologies, especially ones that are expansionist and have, imperialist ambitions. I mean, I see Nazism coming out of, the most reactionary and depraved like parts of the German ruling class. It's something that needs to be stamped out through, you know, revolutionary mobilization, mass mobilization, and it needs to be battled through a consistent application of democracy and democratic principles, to their fullest extent. And so, you know, and then, so in my opinion is that, the best way to fight against Nazism is to be a principled opponent of all kinds of ethno-nationalism and reactionary, exclusionary, tendencies and ideas. And especially when they have power, when it's backed by, rich people, capitalists, when it's backed by military power. And so, I think the lessons of Nazism, I think, obviously the Jewish people have a very specific experience with Nazism. They were, of the 20 million people that Hitler killed, 6 million of them were Jews. That's obviously, they obviously were targeted primarily by Hitler. But I think that, the lessons of Nazism are ultimately universal for all oppressed people and all people who can be victims of oppression and persecution. And I think that it's the realities of Nazism and the horrors of the Holocaust and of imperialism more broadly and colonialism more broadly shows, the necessity to overcome the capitalist imperialist world order and construct a system based on genuine equality of nations and genuine solidarity between all peoples.
So,
And
I
obviously this sounds, this is
right.
abstract in a lot of ways,
Yeah,
but I think it's important to have these kind of goals guide actions today so that we can better, so we have decent political principles that we're working
right.
around in the current moment.
I just what I see, I think some other people see is okay. So you want Jews to give up there's only one Jewish country, one Jewish safe haven. You would give that up and then exchange it for the next time a Hitler arises. Put your put your trust in um uh people like actually I want to bring this up because you tweeted about it, which is this Montreal synagogue protest. um, which I think you were defending, but
Well, I was more so just, I wasn't defending what that guy was saying, which I agree was very stupid, and
that the Jews oppressed Germany.
You guys try to oppress and colonialize South Africa and Germany because one thing is granted. Every single tree and rock that you guys are going to touch will most surely be free.
Yeah, I mean, that,
South Africa. But it's like, I look at that, it's like, oh, these are going to be the people that are going to protect Jews? The guy who's a Nazi outside,
right. I mean,
outside a synagogue?
the thing is listen, any idiot can bring a mic to a protest and say idiotic stuff. I mean, I've organized Palestine protests where I live, and nobody's done anything like that. Nobody, we have open mic. We let people get on the mic and say whatever they want, but no one's gotten up and said anything like that.
But why are they outside synagogues?
Well, my understanding is that that synagogue was holding a real estate sale for like occupied land in the West Bank.
Are you sure that was? I know that's what they said about the Toronto one. That's true of the Montreal one too.
I don't know. Regardless, maybe the Montreal synagogue was being unfairly targeted. I don't really, I feel like if it was the case that they were holding a real estate sale for occupied land, I do think that makes it a fair target for protest. Like, first thing I ever protested was a gay conversion thing at the local evangelical church. So I can't really say that I'm against ever protesting a place of faith, right?
But what about like the opening of the Holocaust Museum in I think it was Copenhagen or Amsterdam the other day? Why was that protested?
I mean, I don't know about that. I'd have to look at the case. I'd have to see, who organized it, what was their reasoning,
Okay.
It could have been stupid, it could have been legitimate.
It was because the
details.
Israeli person was coming. I mean, but
right. And I think personally, I think sometimes, the optics, it's just sometimes it looks so bad, it's just not worth doing. I don't know enough about the situation, and what this person was saying, what they were speaking about, but,
right.
But
I'm saying I've been surprised. If I was an anti-Zionist and I was trying to make my case, I would express empathy and say, I realize why Zionism was created. The pogroms, a lot of these people were driven out of Europe. And okay, we're going to get rid of Israel, but don't worry, we'll protect you.
Right.
I don't see any of that. I really just don't see any of it. I just see Zionists are new Nazis. And just the most aggressive kind of stuff. A lot of it's pretty bloodthirsty. What am I?
Right. I mean,
not
listen,
seeing?
I don't like any kind of bloodthirsty talk.
Yeah.
I don't believe in the death penalty even. Like
Right.
I don't like posting online about killing people and making death threats. That's not my style.
Right. No, I'm not saying you. I'm not
Yeah, and
accusing
listen, when
you,
I
but-
see, my friends, if I have friends who do stuff like that, sometimes I'll like, hey, listen, like, just you don't have to like be as unhinged and edgy as possible online. I think a lot of times, people are trying to just get attention and they go overboard online.
But why aren't you guys that want to abolish Israel? Why aren't you making any overtures to Jews and saying, listen, we know you're going to give up your only safe haven in the world, but we're going to be here for you, and I don't see that. I mean, am I missing something?
I mean, I see it locally at, things that I've, gone to and organized and stuff. I see, Jewish solidarity and, so I think, that I do see that, I
see what?
Well, people, reaching out to, trying to make overtures to Jewish communities and, there was a local event here that, we put together where we reached out to local Jewish communities and tried to, make the case for anti-Zionism. We showed this movie Israelism, and so I think
Yeah, and
I think
let me be fair. Let me be fair. I need to say this. In Charlottesville, when the Nazis came out, and I will always remember this, and I will always say it, the people that came out and opposed those Nazis, a lot of them really don't like Israel.
right, exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
And they were the people on the streets defending Jews and other minorities.
Right.
And it's not axiomatically the true.
Well, that's kind of my point, though, is like
yeah.
it's from a consistent opposition to kind of any type of extremist,
Right.
chauvinistic nationalism.
Yeah.
And so it's
A portion I think there are a lot of anti-Semites who use it as a mask, like David Duke.
well, yeah, obviously,
Yeah.
there are a lot of anti-Semitic grifters who try to hop onto the anti-Israel thing and use that to push their bullshit. And those people need to be exposed. Those people need to be debunked. There needs to be like strong arguments made against anti-Semitism, and there needs to be that education needs to be done. I think that's really what the approach I would take, is that we just needs to be better education against anti-Semitism. And my opinion is that the best antidote to anti-Semitism is having a Marxist understanding of history, so you don't fall into this kind of like vision of history as ethnic groups like competing with each other and conspiring. And because that's the problem, is I think a lot of people are uneducated, and so it's in they buy into like this kind of understanding of history where it's all about like ethnicity and religion. And so it's and they get fed bullshit propaganda. And so I feel like there does need to be better education against anti-Semitism. I agree there.
My thing is, I don't, it does stuff, but for instance, like all these anti-Semitism task force that they're creating at these universities or the White House, the Blue Ribbon Commission on fight, they don't do anything. I mean, honestly, like at the end, most of them just do nothing. They're not very effective. But I agree. I admire what you said. So let me try to figure out how anti-Zionist you are. If they had made a deal, if Arafat had made a deal in 2000, and we're now sitting here, and this is like the 22nd year of a Palestinian state.
Right.
Are you so anti-Zionist you'd be like, that was a horrible decision? We need to you need to start firing those rockets on television.
Yeah, listen,
tomorrow.
my stance is that, I've thought about this a lot, and I would say a two-state solution, negotiating for a two-state solution, is fine if they don't give up the right of return as a long-term goal. I think that I'm fine with them agreeing to not using terrorism or violence to fight for it. But if the Palestinian people, come to the conclusion that we want to negotiate for a two-state solution, I think, they should obviously be allowed to do that. I think, but I would say that they shouldn't agree with Israel to completely drop the right of return. And so I do think the right of return does have like a lot of importance as a democratic demand, as a basic human, as a basic part of the Palestinian national story. But also just to me, it's asking them to give up that goal and to completely give up to them is kind of like national suicide in a way. It just seems to me very unfair to be like, well, you can negotiate with us and have some level of sovereignty, but you have to like completely give up, your dream of as a nation.
Okay, so let's talk about right of return. Gigi Hadid, do you know who that is?
It's familiar.
Okay, supermodel. Half Danish, grew up in Beverly Hills, daughter of a billionaire, Palestinian father, Danish mother, grew up in Beverly Hills. Is that a refugee of 1948?
I mean, technically, yes. They should be allowed to return. I'm fine with biting that bullet.
But is that what you mean by right of return? Or how expansive is your
Anyone I think it's anyone who is, descendant of a refugee of 48 Palestine, I think is,
should have a right to Israel proper.
yeah, a right to citizenship within, what was formerly the Mandate of Palestine. Within any of those
Okay.
territories,
So
whether it be what is
wouldn't that
Israel today or Gaza or what is the West Bank, like they should be allowed to have citizenship in that land.
so would that be like over 20 million people
Um, I think
or
it's more like
16
nine.
million or something
Is
like
it?
that?
I think it's more like 9 million.
Okay, so it's larger than the population of Israel.
Right. I mean,
And
assuming
it
that
would
everyone
include people that
returns.
were born in Beverly Hills and are
Right,
half
but I mean, there are people who are born in Beverly Hills who can go move to Israel,
Okay.
even though, but, so to me, that's like as
You
long
think
as you have a situation where anyone who's Jewish can go live in Israel,
Mhm.
it doesn't make sense
Yeah.
to say anyone who's like a Palestinian shouldn't be able to live there. It just seems fundamentally anti-democratic, in my opinion.
Okay. So
It just
but that is larger than the entire population of Israel.
right.
So first of all, I mean, does that I don't even know, can that many people even live there? I mean, is this practical to double the population like
I mean,
overnight? I mean,
it's the Holy Land. It can be a very
okay.
big place with very big cities.
Okay. Well, but I'm glad that you would be okay if they had agreed to some kind of diplomatic thing.
Right. I mean,
Okay.
I'm still studying the history of the PLO a bit and learning like all the different positions, but I think the rejectionist front was like kind of being ridiculous. They kind of turned themselves into a proxy of Syria, from what I can understand. And I think I don't think it's entirely wrong to negotiate for a two-state solution. But obviously, I prefer a one-state solution. I think that should be the goal. And
Okay.
because this is my general stance on, I prefer larger multinational states. And I think that you can have large states that have multiple different nationalities living within them that can have their rights protected within these states. I think it is possible to do that. I think,
Well,
there
how would that would work out?
I mean, the thing is I don't think we know how it will work out. Like, we'll be creating a new country essentially. Like, we'll be building something completely new, and I think it is going to be incredibly difficult. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I feel like the alternative is essentially segregation of some kind, and I don't think that works either. And so I think, the idea of the PLO, and I was reading a interview between a Israeli Marxist who was anti-Zionist and a member of the PLO in the early 70s. And, the PLO guy was essentially saying, like, listen, like, we ultimately want, one secular democratic state. But, understandably, if we have a two-state solution, perhaps we can start actually meeting with Israelis who are more progressive and start talking with them and learning, and trying to actually build some kind of connections and interracial unity essentially. But
But if you did one state tomorrow, so I'm trying to remember the numbers. What would that be? Well, it depends a lot on would you want one state plus right of return for all the broad Palestinian diaspora?
yes.
Okay. Now, if you did that, then the Jewish population would fall. I don't know. It might be into the 30s or 20s or quite low,
I've
depending
seen
how.
it
Yeah.
essentially, I've seen estimates
Yeah.
that would essentially be 50-50.
Okay. And then you no more right of return for Jews.
I feel like you would have to have a situation where essentially it's 50-50, where immigration is apportioned out equally, maybe to both groups.
But if You remember when they
Ideally, I mean, we'll get rid of borders entirely and anyone can live
uh,
wherever they want. That is kind of
okay.
the goal.
All right, well,
Like, but
yeah, yeah.
you would have to
Let's
have some
stay.
kind of immigration system that would be fair. I don't think that the problem isn't, Jews immigrating to the Holy Land or whatever you want to call it. Like that's not the problem in my book. The problem is the idea of settlerism, it's the settler colonial aspect of it, of dispossession of another people's land and then imposing a segregated system on top of it.
Well, but this is an important detail. So in this ideal one state, if it like remember when they were looking for the Jews in the airplane in Dagestan? They
right.
heard that the Israeli was on a plane and this mob came and they went to the hotel and they're looking, they made the hotel guy show them everybody in the hotel to see if anybody looked Jewish. I mean, and so like there were a few Jews in Dagestan. Could those Jews move to this one state? So like Jews in danger, would they have a right to move to it?
Yeah, I feel like especially if they were like a refugee who's in danger, I feel like that would be a reason to give them a higher place in the immigration quota, I guess.
But would they have a right?
Like they would have now a right of by the basis of being Jewish or by the basis of being like a refugee. Let's say, for example, you have those guys from the Dagestan that are fleeing versus like
Somebody
like
from Congo
versus
okay.
people like that.
So there wouldn't be a difference.
Yeah, but the thing is like let's say there's a quota and some like upper middle class Jews from Brooklyn want to move there. Like should they have the same priority as those guys who are trying to flee like an actual persecution type situation? That's my problem with the law of return, is that it's essentially I agree, like Jewish people or people of any background who are being persecuted need to be able to find refugee status, but the way the law of return works is it just doesn't, like, it puts like someone who's genuinely feeling danger in like the same place as like someone who's just like a rich settler from Brooklyn who wants cheap real estate in the West Bank.
So are you saying, okay, so in this one state, the Jews of Dagestan and refugees who are, let's say, Christian in Congo, they both apply to move to the new one state. Are you saying they should just be looked at the same?
I think you could make a case that they should, that they shouldn't. I don't know. I think you can make the argument that the Jews have more of a connection to that land than the Christians do because of ancient ancestry. I'm not sure
But the
that's
automatic right of return would not
yeah, I don't
be there.
I don't know if it's I don't I think it just doesn't make sense in my opinion from a democratic perspective.
Yeah. Okay,
But
so yeah.
I genuinely am in favor of people being able to move and live where they want. It's just a question of how you arrange that in the best way possible.
No, but how do you think this one state would actually work out if we did it tomorrow? What would the numbers be? Okay, let's leave aside the diaspora questions. I think it would be, what is it, like 60 40? Wait, 55. It wouldn't be half. I think it would be majority Arab, I think.
I figured it would be like a very slight Arab
Okay.
minority.
Okay. So how do you let's the first 10 years? I would anticipate here's what would happen. Even if, let's say, the government, let's say, was like a moderate Palestinian Arab, and he says all the right things, what I fear is you'd have groups like Hamas and much more extreme groups do massacres against Jews, and then when they happen again, and the government that is majority Arab doesn't prevent it from happening again and again, you'd start seeing massive waves of Jews leaving. I think at the end of 10 years, it'd be very small Jewish population left. That's how I think it would happen. What do you think?
I think that it really depends on what kind of government they get in there. My general argument would be that you need some kind of I would advocate for like some kind of socialist workers' party that would be multinational and secular. Would I don't think they would be able to take over the government initially, but I think you know building class solidarity would be the best way to kind of prevent overly ethnic violence from blowing out. I think that's one way is you need to build the economic arrangements that allow for cooperation between nationalities. So I think if they were able to get a decent, some kind of decent like left-wing party was able to form, it could go well. I think regardless of, I think regardless of, how rough it is in the early stages, I think, it's obviously not going to be easy. There's a lot of hatred that exists, there's going to be tension, but I think generally it's easier to start building that basis for unity and building cooperation once you no longer have institutional segregation than when you do have institutional segregation. So
But what is Hamas doesn't believe in secular.
Okay, but Hamas, I feel like if you had a one-state solution, who supports Hamas anymore? Like, where does Hamas get its gas from? I mean, because it was really like from the kind of disappointment with Oslo and the disappointment with the PA and disappointment with the PLO and everything that Hamas was
Didn't
able
they
to.
Didn't they intentionally destroy Oslo? Isn't that why they were doing bus bombings during it? I mean,
Well, yeah, Hamas, they were against the Oslo Accords from the beginning. But as the situation got worse for Palestinians, and the PA became more and more of an ally of Israel, essentially, and controlling the West Bank with the whole kind of security subcontracting arrangement, and the settlers kept coming in. Even under Rabin, the settlers were increasing in the West Bank. Um, it creates a situation where the Palestinians, because the Palestinian Authority has agreed to this kind of subcontracting status of Israel, that Hamas are really the only force that is expressing some kind of resistance to the status quo in general and to, the process of settlement in the West Bank, as well as just the general you know, conditions that the Palestinians were under at the time. And so, I think Hamas really does I feel like after, in a post like settlement situation, like Hamas are probably just a conservative Islamist party. They probably, have some following, but I think from my understanding, like Hamas's success, and was really more out of disappointment with the Palestinian Authority than out of a real adherence to the Islamist ideology.
I understand, and I make this point when I interview people who are supportive of Israel. When they point to, for instance, they'll say, "Look at these polls. Look at all the support Hamas has in the West Bank after October 7th." And I'll say, "Well, put yourself in their shoes. Under Fatah, what do they see? They see Israeli settlements getting deeper and deeper in the West Bank, humiliating Abbas. And so they want somebody who's going to actually do something, right?
Right.
Yeah, I totally understand that. But I mean, the rhetoric for instance, a lot of these pro-Palestine things are you're colonial, go back to Europe. I don't see a lot of I mean, I don't think the Israelis are wrong. Israeli Jews are wrong to think these people want to just drive me out. That's what they want to do. They don't think I have any right to be here. I mean, is that wrong?
I mean, I think, there are some extremists who take a more like kind of, ethno-nationalist stance that they talk about, oh, we just need to drive all this, these Israeli settlers out of the entire country, so basically the kind of drive the Jews into the sea type rhetoric, You do see some of that in the more extreme, I hadn't seen much of it in the pro-Palestine movement before October 7th, but I think I did see a little bit more of it afterwards. That kind of like rhetoric of, like we just need to kick out all the Israelis.
Well, I see this Algeria, Matt. I've seen Matt Leck and a lot of people make this Algeria example, for instance.
Right.
So here's a question. So you say that Israel is a colonial, explain to me what
Settler colonialism. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I also think, the United States, the country I live
Right.
in is settler colonial.
Okay.
It's in a different phase of settler colonialism. It's in a different type of settler colonial in a lot of ways, but I think there is a lot of the critiques I make of Israel also apply to the United States in a lot of ways. And, and I support Native Americans and their struggles as well. So, I think I really am just trying to be consistent in a lot of ways here. But
Okay.
what I mean by settler colonialism is, you really have two types of colonialism historically, and there's different like maybe combinations of these two basic types. But like you have extractive colonialism, classical colonialism, where you have the metropole and the colony. The metropole occupies the colony and exploits it for its labor and its resources, and it denies sovereignty to the colony, and it rearranges productive arrangements in the colony to its benefit. And you have settler colonialism, which is where you have initially you have a situation where you have settlers usually funded by a metropole and supported by a metropole go into the colonized territory. In the case of Israel, what you have is the British Mandate of Palestine is controlled by the British, and the settlers are obviously the Zionist movement, who had been going into Palestine under the Ottoman Empire as well, and acquiring land and buying land. But this really picks up when the British come into colonial occupation of Palestine, and the Zionist movement is obviously it's sending in its settlers into the into Palestine, and you have the land purchases and stuff that happen, which already are dispossessing the indigenous Arabs of their land. And but with settler colonialism is essentially the settlers, they are trying to form a new nation. They're trying to form a new society entirely. They're not going into the new territory in order to exploit its labor and exploit its resources. They want the land itself. So with like kind of classical colonialism, the aim is to exploit the natives and to extract their labor and resources. Whereas with the colonization of Palestine by the Zionists, the natives were essentially an obstacle to forming a Jewish majority state on that land, regardless of because the early Zionists, they wanted all of it. They wanted the whole of Eretz Israel, as they called it, like. But they were willing to settle for less on pragmatic grounds. But ideally, the vision of Zionism was that, we were going to, basically make all of this land a Jewish majority state. And so eventually, the settlers, they revolt against the metropole. They revolt against the British. We all know what happens. the British mandate eventually leaves and the UN sides the partition. So
Yeah, I just don't like the Algeria example
well,
because
Algeria is a different type of colonialism too,
there
because with
there's no
Algeria,
mother country for the
right. It's not a
yeah.
mother country. It's settler colonialism means that there isn't a mother country anymore. That the settlers eventually revolt against the mother country and form a new nation
Well, but
entirely, which
was
is what
there
happens in
ever
the United States.
yeah,
Like
but
the
was there ever a mother country for Israel?
what was that?
There was never a mother colon. There was no.
British. I mean, it was the British
Well,
mandate. They
they
had
came
a
from Russia, Poland.
sure, but I mean, their existence, their ability to immigrate there and settle there was being sponsored by the British.
But then it was blocked by the British.
Right, but then it was blocked by the British, which is why they overthrew the British and formed a new state. And
And there was never a guarantee. I'm just saying it was very different from France and
yeah, no, it's a unique
Algeria.
type of colonialism.
Yeah,
But listen,
yeah.
like the United States was formed through the British
Right. No,
financed it.
I get what I get what you're
This
saying.
colony, these settlers, came
Yeah.
into the Americas. A lot of them fleeing persecution and famine, horrible circumstances, but they were coming in to dispossess the natives of their land, and eventually the British, came to be a limitation on their ability to do that. So they overthrow the British and create a new nation. And so I
Right.
think that's what we
Right.
mean when we
I
say
get you.
settler colonialism.
I got you. So are you opposed to a Jewish state, a safe haven state for Jews, no matter the size? I think there was a famous quote from one of the Arab leaders that they would oppose Israel even if it was the size of a
Right,
postage.
because listen, like
Yeah,
nobody
yeah.
wants to have their country partitioned by a foreign power.
No,
Like,
I'm saying just like if it was an empty 10-mile triangle on the Alaskan coast.
I mean,
Oh,
yeah, I obviously like I wouldn't put any energy into
okay.
opposing that.
Got it. Got it.
Right, like I mean, on principle, like as I am a
Yeah.
Marxist, a
Yeah. Yeah.
communist. I want to eventually
Right.
move beyond the state and
Right.
beyond nations. But if Israel was, not if there was an Israel created that wasn't dispossessing
Right.
another population,
Okay.
like I wouldn't care.
Right.
Like
Right. Right.
I would think that it's, I would like like the world to evolve to a point where something like that, wasn't necessary or seen as necessary by the people who live there.
I got you. I got
But
you.
I wouldn't be going to Palestine rallies and organizing stuff because of it, because it's just not a high priority. To me it's like no different than if like some hippies like start a commune out in the desert, like
Right. Right. I got you. So I want to move a little bit to what's going on now. And so tremendous suffering, to say the least, in Gaza right now. We're seeing horrific pictures of young children. They're rail thin.
yeah,
There's
no, the
been
starvation is kicking
yeah,
in. I
yeah,
think
yeah.
we're at risk of possibly
Yeah,
hundreds of thousands of
yeah,
deaths potentially.
yeah.
It's terrifying. It's
Right.
I think it's genocide because to me it's a deliberate denial of the people of Gaza of the essentials of life.
No, we'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to acknowledge for anybody out there who thinks I don't see that, I don't have any feeling for that. I just want to, acknowledge that. I mean, there's so many people from Gaza who have lost. I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like to be able to say I've lost 35 of my relatives.
Yeah, I know people locally
Horrible.
who have
Yeah.
relatives there who are going
Yeah.
through absolute hell.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
So we can't deny that. I want to ask you what to believe is very sort of difficult. And so these are two tweets. I'll read them. One is from Hind Gaza. Israel did not like the fact that Al-Shifa Hospital was operating again. They invaded it and arrested most of the doctors, stripped and humiliated them. Now here's a tweet from a guy named Nadav Pollock. While the IDF arrested 300 Hamas and PIJ in Shifa who returned there after the IDF cleared the hospital weeks ago. The reason I share that is, and I saw all these other tweets where like somebody tweeted, oh, they heard the hospital was working again, so they went there to kill patients and doctors. They risked their lives and did this thing just because they heard that there were some doctors they could kill. Who do you believe?
I mean, I just like I don't really like believe anything I see on Twitter these days. Like,
Yeah.
it's just there's just so much bullshit out there. I just wait until something's been confirmed by multiple sources until I believe anything. I think like I just think that's you just wait and see. With a lot of this stuff, like I think it can be easy to just kind of hear something sensational and jump on it. And,
Right.
I think you just have to wait and see with a lot of stuff and not get, but I mean, I think, Israel has shown a massive capacity for terror and war crimes throughout its history. And so, I think, there is a long history of dehumanization of the Palestinians because, there's this idea that this is our land and they're an obstacle to us having our land. And, they're only, fighting us because they hate Jews, not, because they're just, so there is this dehumanization, and I feel
There
like,
in Israeli society, that is undeniable that there is that rhetoric. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
so I feel like that kind of, dehumanizing rhetoric and just the kind of military culture, it lends itself to just absolutely horrific atrocities,
But what's interesting is if you listen to the people with the crazy, like this guy Moshe Feiglin, for instance, who was like, just treat after October 7th. He's like, just treat Gaza like Dresden, Hiroshima.
Right.
Just drive everybody out. Those people hate the IDF. They hate the leaders of the IDF. Do you know that?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I know that, in like, for example, like the Mossad are really huge fans of a lot of these extreme right wingers as well. I mean, I know there are divisions in Israeli society, and
No, but they regard the IDF generals as globalists. They even call them like non-Jewish American globalist puppet. I mean, it's sort of funny. Like my way of monitoring Israel is I don't speak Hebrew, unfortunately. So I do it through English language. So I use a few different sources to keep tabs on the Israeli far right. One is JNS and this woman, Caroline Glick. And then funny, I don't know if you've seen this, but Jonathan Pollard, the spy who got released. Do you know him?
um
He's famous. He gave Israel stuff, but he got
oh yeah,
released.
I've heard of him.
He's
Yeah.
living in Israel now, and he does this hilarious podcast with this rabbi. And it's really funny because like they just believe all this idiot. They believe like Michelle Obama is a man.
Yeah, it's almost like Israeli MAGA,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. And they refer to Biden as the Biden administration, and they think the COVID vaccine is killing everybody. And they're the way, but they hate the IDF generals. Anyways, but I know you
Yeah,
get
but
that.
they don't hate the IDF generals because they don't kill enough,
No,
Palestinians.
that is why. That is why.
Well, but no, but because sorry, because they kill too many Palestinians. Like they don't hate
Oh,
them.
no. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
but
that's what I meant. Sorry.
they see the IDF as weak and they don't
Well, yeah, I
even.
mean, I know that there's a lot of that rhetoric in Israel right now. Is that the IDF, would be, kicking more ass right now if we didn't like cuck out to these liberal globalists who believe in human rights, blah blah blah.
No, but the liberal globalists who are the IDF generals.
Right.
That's who they. Yeah.
But I mean, you
Yeah.
have like, American Nazis who, think that the American military is this woke
Right.
global
Right. Right.
homo
Right.
institution,
Right.
but that doesn't stop the US military from
Right.
doing horrible
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
The brown people that these Nazis
So
also hate.
so here's on the genocide thing. here's one of my issues. I looked up The Intercept when they started calling it a genocide. They started calling it genocide on October 12th, I think, or the 14th.
Right.
Okay. So it's like only a few days after October 7th. I looked up what was the casualties at that point, and it was below like 4,000.
Right.
How can it be a genocide when the casualties are below 4,000?
Well, I think, at that point, they had already killed you know, like the casualties are at 4,000. I mean, that's already like
It was
almost
below that.
it's below that. Okay, but still, I mean, it's already double how many people were killed on October 7th. So, I mean, right there, I mean, it's clear that, one side has killed more people. But that aside, I think, the point is to raise the alarm because there was a lot of genocidal rhetoric immediately after October 7th.
Right.
There was, this kind of talk of starving Gaza, of, attacking infrastructure, of destroying the capacity of Gazans to live. I think, there was a lot of stuff being talked about in Israeli policy circles that, like you already had like talks of ethnic cleansing, like, in a lot of these circles, happening pretty quickly, when this war started. So I think,
Yeah. But if
there's
it
the
was
conspiracy theory that like Netanyahu like knew it was going to happen and let it happen, so he had a reason to like launch his grand ethnic cleansing plan. I don't know if I buy that,
No, I don't believe that.
I think Netanyahu is a deeply evil man. I really think he is one of the most evil people right now, but I don't know if he's that evil. But regardless, like,
But you still entertain that possibility?
the idea that he let it
It was
happen.
an inside job.
I mean, inside job is a bit too strong. I think, let it happen would maybe be. I don't even. I'm not saying I agree with this. I said it's, a small possibility. I'll entertain its possibility, but I genuinely think that they were caught off guard.
So I think Putin killed 100,000 in Grozny in Chechnya in 2000. And famously, he carpet bombed Grozny. There was like nothing left, right? You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah,
Okay.
the Chechen
Was that
War.
genocide?
I mean, I think you could, I don't know enough about it to say, to be quite frank. I'd have to look into it, but
Okay.
because I mean, with genocide, it's we did terror bombings in Germany during World War II that killed tons of civilians. Was that a genocide? Well, I don't really think it counts as a genocide, but I think with Israel, it's you do have a population that is stateless, that doesn't have sovereignty, that's occupied and subjected.
And they can't move out. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
exactly. So
understand that.
it's a situation where you have like a colonized population that's there's a structural subjugation there
Right.
that so I feel like that kind of is a factor you have to look at when we discuss genocide. Is there that kind of structural subjugation?
But
And
if the goal is to just kill them all, why do they call? I don't think this has ever been done by an army in war. Before they drop a bomb somewhere in Gaza, they make thousands of phone calls. Are you aware of this?
no, I mean I've heard
To
that
warn people so they can leave. So why would you do that if you want a genocide?
protocol, show that you're following international law
Well,
as a
that
kind of legalistic maneuver, but also you know I I don't really buy that this is entirely effective, and that this, because first of all, people don't have places to go, and people are
Right.
afraid that if they leave their home, they're not
No.
going to be allowed to return because for historical
No,
reasons.
I agree. It's and sometimes when I talk about this on Twitter, I always try to say like I'm not trying to say that this is a good. I'm not, you know, I just want words to, mean things like, you can go from brutal war to war crimes to ethnic cleansing to
Right,
genocide.
right.
Like I saw somebody post that America is supporting 4 different genocides right now, and they said a genocide in Haiti,
Yeah, I mean
I'm like,
that's
what do you
silly.
mean a genocide in Haiti?
Well,
There's
yeah, I
like
mean,
a yeah,
I don't think
yeah.
the U.S. should invade Haiti. I don't think we should be
But
involved in that.
that's
But
not a
it's not,
genocide,
yeah, no, I don't, that's obvious. But
right?
listen, I do think there's a strong case for genocide being committed in Gaza. Like, I do think that, that's it's, the fact that it's a subjugated population that can't leave, or that are being denied food, aid trucks are being blocked, they let in a little bit of
The,
aid, but
I
clearly not
agree
enough
with
aid is
you.
getting.
They're not letting in enough, but they are letting in aid trucks. They're
Yeah, but
just
that's not,
checking them. It's
they're
taking
they're
like,
letting in just enough to where they can say they're letting in aid. Okay, like it's really bad. And
well, do you know when Biden suggested building that pier that the Yov Gallant, for instance, was very supportive of that idea?
right, but I we don't know what if there's ulterior motives for this pier as well. You know, like,
Like what?
well, maybe they want it as a way to, facilitate ethnic cleansing and so people can leave Gaza. Maybe it's just a way for, the US to, increase its presence in the Mediterranean. I mean, to me, like, I just don't buy that, this port is what's keeping aid from, like, getting in.
Do
Like,
you,
I feel like it's the Israeli government that's keeping aid from getting in. And
so
what Biden needs to do is say we're gonna stop funding your war if you keep doing this shit. I think it's really that simple.
I think, listen, I've always said from the beginning, herbicide, I think there's a good case for herbicide. For instance, why is the IDF blown up all these universities? Right? Why would you do that?
Well, you
You
mean to
know,
me, it's about destroying their capacity to exist as a nation. Like you destroy their intellectuals, you destroy, their culture, you destroy the infrastructure of, having a national consciousness. I mean, I think it seems like this Israeli government especially just wants to destroy the Palestinian people as a people, so they never have to think about accepting any kind of two-state solution in the future.
one thing I have been really angry about is, and I don't get why nobody points out, is the just horrible strategy of Israel. I mean, like one of the most basic things in war, right, is you cut off the supply lines of the enemy.
Right.
And it's 6 months in, they still haven't cut off the Rafah tunnels, which are the like supply lines. I don't even think Sinwar is technically in Gaza. I suspect he's in a tunnel right across the border.
No, yeah, I'm sure that he's
Yeah.
probably, in some tunnel somewhere. I mean, that's, Hamas obviously has prepared for this. They have, the elaborate tunnel system.
I I do suspect that Netanyahu, for political reasons, is trying to extend this.
No, I think
Yeah.
Netanyahu is, I mean, I think he's trying to do ethnic cleansing. I think that he's is trying to, I mean, there's all signs point towards that. And so I think to him, like his military goal is to do ethnic cleansing under the guise of destroying Hamas. And I
I
think,
I've asked Israelis about that, and they say that's not what they're discussing. I mean, so here's what Israel says: we want the hostages back, and we want to destroy Hamas. Okay, and I listen every day to so much media it's in English from Israelis, and that's what they talk about. Is they really don't want to end this thing and have Sinwar able to come out and say we're still here. I don't think but I've gotten DMs from people that I know that said they don't care about Hamas, they don't care about the hostages, they just want to do genocide. And my point of view is I don't think they're acting when they talk about destroying Hamas.
sure, but I feel like it's destroying Hamas and doing genocide are pretty compatible if you think about it. Like, if Hamas is like, a nationalist resistance movement that's you know, has its objective basis in resistance of the Palestinian people, then destroying Hamas and doing genocide can kind of go hand in hand. I mean, you know, like in the Vietnam War, for example, like the objective was to destroy the Viet Cong. That was the military objective, is when we need to destroy the Viet Cong. But the reality is that when the population supports the Viet Cong because they see them as a resistance movement fighting for their rights to self-determination, destroying the Viet Cong can very much just lead to a general war on the population itself. And you see this in the rhetoric of a lot of Israelis. They talk about like, oh, they all support Hamas. All of the Gazans, they all support Hamas. They're not innocent, so don't cry about them. And so when your goal is to destroy a resistance movement that has a base within the people, genociding the people can very much be a part of destroying that resistance group. They can work together, basically, is what I'm saying.
But I mean, when I look at what the IDF does every day, I mean, they're down in these tunnels, destroying these tunnels. They're not going, oh, here's a kid's school, let's blow that up. I mean, I'm sure that that's happened in the course of things, but
I mean, I've seen some stuff like that, man. Like I've seen, IDF guys going around people's houses.
Going around people's houses, taking underwear, horrible,
Yeah, just,
stupid,
there's all kinds of just stuff
but
that's clearly assaults on the dignity of the
well,
population.
but have you seen a video where like here's a bunch of kids on a playground, let's just take the machine gun and kill them all? I mean, I haven't seen that.
I mean, but the fact is that like just because the worst possible atrocities that we can imagine haven't been documented doesn't mean that it's.
But they do. But why do they spend all this time destroying these tunnels?
Well, because they obviously want to destroy Hamas's capacity to strike at Israel. Okay. I mean, I never denied that. I definitely believe they want to destroy Hamas as a movement. They would want to destroy any kind of violent armed resistance movement, whether it was the PFLP, or Hamas, or Abu Nadal, or whatever, like any kind of armed movement that is a threat to Israeli security, they're obviously going to want to destroy.
Doesn't that seem like a huge mistake that Netanyahu didn't go in through the south at first, cut off the Rafah tunnels, no more supply lines, no more exit? Have you thought about that at all?
I don't know, because I don't know enough about the military strategy side of things, especially, from the Israeli angle, but maybe there is a reason why that didn't happen. Maybe, I don't know enough to say, whether Netanyahu's strategy makes sense or not. I have seen people say that it doesn't make sense and that he's just kind of fumbling through this. Which is probably true.
Let's talk about Hamas's leadership. So they've been in power, what is it, 18 years?
Since 2007, right?
2005 or 7, yeah. So it's pretty clear now that many billions of dollars, they were building infrastructure in Gaza below ground.
Yeah, of course they were.
The estimates are insane that it's more tunnels than the London Underground. It's like 300 plus miles.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing, honestly, like what they were.
Yeah. But now a lot of it, perhaps all of it, is going to be destroyed. Was that a good investment? I mean, how have they done as leaders of Gaza in your view?
I know there's a lot of discontent with their leadership of Gaza. I think for that reason, the Al-Qassam brigades are more popular than Hamas itself as a party. So I think a lot of Palestinians, they support the armed resistance part of Hamas, but they're not as supportive of their governance in Gaza. And I think that is, that just kind of goes to my point that, the popularity of Hamas is more connected to their status as an armed resistance movement than because of like their Islamist ideology and stuff. So,
Right.
I think if I imagine if I lived in Gaza, as a secular, Marxist, I would probably have a lot of qualms with their governance, like I think I remember reading somewhere that they tried to impose a hijab early in their rule, and there were actually like protests against it and like riots against it, so they only made it like recommended instead of mandatory. So, I think that, Hamas, you do have, they have, in my opinion, moderated because they have had to govern Gaza and they have had to actually like interact with normal Palestinian civil society. So they have moderated a bit. They're still obviously Islamist and still conservative. And, I'm not going to deny that there's anti-Semitism there. I think,
Oh yeah, I mean they've called Jews in speeches called Jews pigs and
yeah, I
stuff.
mean, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
no, I'm not going to deny
Sure,
that, but I think they have
sure.
moderated. I think, they're I think a lot because a lot of more secular minded Palestinian nationalists joined Hamas as, because they were the only people really fighting back effectively,
I
you
mean,
know.
is it hard to say they moderated after October 7th when the spokesman says we're going to do it over and over 1,000
Well,
times?
that's kind of what you do when you're in war, though. You you have to threaten your enemy and,
Right,
keep the but yeah, I mean,
right.
October 7th, we can
So,
litigate what exactly happened on October 7th, but
so let's talk about Aaron Bush now.
right,
I have a problem with people making him a saint. I saw tweets where they're talking about his amazing humanity, how humane he was. And then I read his Reddit post, not the fake one, the real one.
right,
And I think it was a few days after October 7th, and where children were killed, old people, old ladies at a bus stop were killed, disabled little girl who can walk was killed at the Nova Music Festival. And he said that no is I think he basically said no Israeli is a civilian.
right.
And I remember being shocked the day of October 7th, hearing that. I mean, do you believe that?
You know, when people say that, I think I don't agree with that technically. Like, I don't think all, I don't support targeting non-combatants. I don't like that, innocents died on October 7th, even if I genuinely think, historically we might look back at October 7th as more akin to the Tet Offensive and other kind of anti-imperialist revolts that featured a lot of atrocities, but ultimately were against an occupying power. But listen, like I think when people say that no Israeli is a civilian, what they're talking about is to the extent that there's two lines. There's all Israelis are settlers and no Israelis are civilians, and I think it's worth unpacking these. When they say like all Israelis are settlers, like obviously there's literal settlers in the West Bank, like the people who are going in and then stealing land and actual literal settlers. But there's also the fact that Jewish Israelis do have like a privileged position in that society, because the Jewish National Fund owns all the land. Even, Arab citizens or, Palestinian citizens of Israel, for example, are, suffer from housing discrimination because of Jewish National Fund control over the land, for example. So, and there's the fact that, you have the conscription into the IDF and a lot of the kind of militaristic socialization that ordinary Israelis are put into, where in a way, like, if you're an Israeli citizen, you're also kind of expected to be a soldier and, someone who is, a soldier for Zionism, essentially.
Yeah, I think I'm talking about the disabled child.
Right. I mean, yeah, obviously, I don't think, a baby is a settler who needs to be killed or whatever, or a disabled grandma or whatever. Like I feel like that kind of rhetoric, from Aaron Bush now, I do think he was a very noble and brave person. I think, his politics were still developing. I think I don't think that he meant that, innocent children should be killed or that he's okay with killing children. I don't think that's what he meant. I think he just sees Israeli society as a whole kind of complicit in the occupation, and so his kind of sympathy for them was limited. And, I think that's where a lot of people in the radical left had been at that point, was just it was a kind of chickens coming home to roost moment, I
Right.
think
Yeah, I mean, and let me say that I understand, like I'll see Israelis saying, "Oh, we weren't occupying Gaza and it wasn't a prison." It, no, it was sort of I mean, yeah, sort of a prison. Yeah. I mean, there's a question of I think it's totally when you have Hamas firing all these. I mean, you got to admit this. It was bizarre that the Israelis, they literally would call when the rockets came from Gaza, they would call it rocket season. That's pretty abnormal to just accept rockets being fired on you and call like it's a weather event.
right.
Okay.
But
So
I
like I only bring that up because I think given that it is reasonable that the Israeli Navy imposed uh they have restrictions on what could be imported to Gaza. They're not going to allow Iran to send like advanced weaponry to Gaza. I mean, for obvious reasons. And I mean, they claimed for years that they were using all this material to dig tunnels and rockets, and that appears to have been true. I don't think that justifies all of those restrictions, but you sort of understand that. But it was, in a sense, I get the prison analogy.
no,
Um,
it's an
yeah.
open air prison, and I mean I don't agree with the blockade, but I don't really think the state of Israel should have been created in the first place. But regardless, like, it is an open air prison, and it's the rocket season. Yeah, that's obviously abnormal, but it's also abnormal to have 2 million people living in that kind of condition. Like
So I think the fundamental question is whether this situation is the way it is because I heard somebody say in a Twitter space the other day that Zionism mandates that they have to like control and ethnically cleanse Gaza and the West Bank. And I was saying Ehud Barak was a Zionist, is a Zionist, and he wanted to, give up that land. And if they had cut a deal and this we had the two-state solution, Zionism would still exist. And I think that if it was peaceful, if there was no attacks from those territories, there seems to be an idea that Israelis really want to send their kids to go patrol around Gaza and West Bank. Like, they would prefer not to have to do any of that. They really do fear that if you did just let Hamas and Gaza import whatever they want, they would import like these weapons from Iran, and there would be an October 7th times 100. So what's your take on that?
on whether Zionism
Is this about
necessitates.
trust or is this about land?
I think it's about land fundamentally, in my opinion. Like, fundamentally, it is a question of nationalism and of national oppression, and the solution lies in addressing the national question and addressing the lack of national rights for the Palestinians. That's really what it comes down to.
Let me rephrase this. If the Israeli people knew 100% that they would give a Palestinian state, give sovereignty, and you can connect the Gaza and the West Bank with highways, whatever, and that state would never attack Israel, would never fire a rocket, they would just go live their lives, develop the Palestinian state for the next 100 years. Do you think Israelis would take that deal?
I think it would probably be 50-50 maybe. I think some would for sure. I think there probably is a lot of, the more anti-Netanyahu bloc in Israel probably would take it, yeah. But I
You don't
think
think a majority would?
oh, I don't know. It's hard to say because, like reading opinion polls coming out of Israel, it seems like there is just a strong sense of just, no two-state solution can ever happen,
But
especially after October 7th.
yeah, but I'm saying, but they don't see. They think they think that a Palestinian state would just be allowing them to do a bigger October 7th. I'm saying if they knew, there would never be an
Right,
attack.
but I don't think that, that's it's a very difficult hypothetical to answer.
Why?
But I like to go back to, well, just because like we don't know, it's hard to do opinion polling on, a question like that because, I think I think a lot of Zionists, like, they do see all of the land of Eretz Israel
There
as
are crazy people on the far right in Israel who believe like, for instance, Moshe Feiglin, who, if you don't know him, is a fascinating figure. He actually speaks English. You should listen to him. He's bizarre, former libertarian. You'd be interested. He believes the borders. I don't even believe he believes this, but he says where are the borders of Israel? He says from the Nile to the Euphrates,
yeah,
half of
that's
Iraq, and it's just, and he says it with a smile. And it's like you can't be serious. Like there are, but you're right. There are insane, but they're very small. They're very small
well, no, I
portions.
mean, but Netanyahu, like, he seems to basically believe that all of Greater Israel should
Well,
be
what do you
under
mean by Greater Israel?
like the mandate of Palestine, the historic like British
Oh,
mandate of Palestine territory. Like he wants all of the West Bank, all of East Jerusalem, all he seems to think that it all should be under Israeli control, full Israeli control. Because the idea of
yeah.
Zionism is that this is historic Jewish land and that Jews are just simply returning to their homeland and taking their land back. So if you really do believe in that idea, it does kind of follow that like all of this land should be yours at the
So
very
what
least.
percent of Zionists though believe that Israel should invade Iraq? I
I
mean,
mean, Iraq. But Iraq was a part
0.
of the historic mandate of Palestine.
Oh, whoa. Well, Eretz Israel, that is like the Euphrates to the
Okay,
Nile,
okay. So
right?
I mean more
Yeah.
specifically,
Okay. The mandate.
the
I see
mandate.
what you're
Yeah,
saying. Okay.
yeah. Because yeah, you do have like the super extreme Zionists who like want to go even beyond that, and but yeah, I mean that the idea that like all of the historic like, mandate of Palestine essentially is rightful Jewish land.
So you don't think they would take peace if they knew it, and they would say we don't have to be hated and protested anymore. We don't have to send our kids to, patrol these things, have this endless conflict. We could just end it and live in peace. You don't think you're not sure a majority would be for that in Israel.
Right now, yeah, I don't know. I think the feelings of national revenge are too high. I think that, I think in the 90s, I think, there was a moment where that feeling was in existence. But I think there is just so much extreme nationalism in Israel right now. And it's hard to say. I think, there still is, the peace camp. But
Um,
I don't know.
I've been thinking about protest movements in America and where this current anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-ceasefire protests, and for the record, I've never said anything bad about any of the ceasefire movements or people calling for a ceasefire. I've always respected that. There's a ton of suffering in Palestine. It's totally reasonable for anybody to be against that. Have no problem with that at all. My question is, I'm not sure. So I was thinking about, this is one of the largest mobilizations I've ever seen. I think Black Lives Matter and then the anti-Iraq war protests.
Yeah.
That's the only two things I can even think of. But I was thinking about, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years. Did we have one anti-Afghanistan war protest, like of any size after?
There were some, but they weren't big enough, I think that, but that's a failing of the American people,
Right. But I wanted to ask, as a Marxist or communist, sorry if those aren't the right words for you.
No, those are the right words. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we see any of this for universal health care?
I mean, you did though. I mean, you had the whole Bernie Sanders movement.
Okay.
And that was, that got millions of people out to canvass and vote. And, I went out and canvassed for Bernie Sanders, even though I had my disagreements with him. And, I'm in DSA. I've phone baked for universal health care. I've, done all that stuff. So,
I'm just saying, when I look at like somebody like Owen Jones and I would love to have Matt. I know you were on the show. I'd love to have Matt Leck on the show.
Yeah.
But for these figures, this seems to be not just the number one issue, sort of abolishing Israel, basically, as like a life political goal. It seems like the only issue at times. I don't really know, if you abolish Israel tomorrow, I don't know, how does that improve the lives of the homeless people in LA?
No, I
all the
think
people without health care.
Right. I think, there's a general issue of U.S. militarism and U.S. imperialism. And at all these rallies that I protest here locally, like one of the big chants we'll always do is money for jobs and education, not for war and occupation. That's a basic, I think, it comes out of a basic like anti-militarist position, which is that, the United States is a hegemonic empire that, puts billions of dollars into having military bases all around the world to maintain this hegemonic position of that, to derive economic benefits from unequal exchange with, poorer countries. And there's a whole general like leftist critique of U.S. imperialism. And I think Israel and the U.S. backing of Israel is one of the starkest kind of examples of that today. Like the fact that we have this system of, giving billions to Israel every year for, weapons systems.
I'm against that, by the way.
Yeah,
I'm against USA.
And I think, that is, just the fact that we can do that while they're committing all these war crimes, but we have homeless people and, we don't even have health care. And there's just that basic reality of U.S. imperialism, as this behemoth that oppresses the world. And so I think in the situation of Israel, I think is, it really is kind of like the Vietnam of our time. It's very similar to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. It's obviously different. It's not the U.S. itself invading and occupying another country, but it is the U.S. supporting, this occupation regime. And so I think that this is one of those moments where kind of a lot of the different contradictions, not just American society, but like the whole world system, like the whole kind of, imperialist world system come into play. The reality of that the United States is this hegemonic world power that props up this state in the Middle East that, at the same time, the US it's starting to get more and more entangled with Russia and China. There's a general kind of sense that the U.S. is declining as a hegemonic empire. And so, this kind of relationship with Israel and the kind of behemoth that Israel has become is symptomatic of a broader kind of crisis of U.S. imperialism. And so I think anti-imperialist leftists are going to hyper-focus on this issue because it's kind of like a fault line in the global system that we're trying to dismantle.
So, and again, if Matt, I'd love to. This is why I'm hoping to have on lots of anti-Zionists, because I want to understand the viewpoint, and I don't see a lot of these discussions. So I'd love to have him on the show. But for instance, I watch a show with David Griscom on Left Reckoning, and they were really like, I think they were talking about maybe it would have been better if Dr. Oz had been elected in Pennsylvania. So if a Republican had won a Senate seat, and I'm thinking about, we live in the richest country in the world, still doesn't have universal health care, while Italy, Germany, Sweden, they all have universal health care. You know, that's outrageous. We have people like going bankrupt because they get stomach cancer. We have literally people who get shot at like nightclubs in mass shootings who
Right.
in their hospital bed have to start a GoFundMe to pay for their medical bills. It's, you know, disgusting, right? You'd agree with that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right. So with that is like a crisis. And the way that we're going to get there, whether we like it or not, is like you have to even have a chance. It's very annoying. You have to have like 60 Democrat Senate votes, right?
Right.
And we got people who say they care about these issues, but are like, you know what? I hate Israel so much. That is such a number one priority. Is maybe we should have elected Dr. Oz.
Right. I mean,
Because
that's, you know, that's obviously just probably like a joke. I mean, like,
no, they sound pretty serious. They
yeah,
thought
I
maybe
mean,
he was a little more iffy on Israel. Like,
I don't think Dr. Oz is iffy on Israel. I mean,
oh, they thought, you know, he's Turkish or anyways. But
but here's the thing. Here's the
yeah.
thing is that I think that one of the big problems historically, you know, I believe in, you know, learning from the past socialist movements that we've had and learning from their mistakes and where they went wrong and trying to apply those lessons today. And one of the biggest betrayals of the socialist movement ever was when, you know, the German socialists and the French socialists and, you know, they all got on board with World War One, basically, and supported the militarism of their own country. And so I think, you know, socialists, in my opinion, we need to do the kind of educational work against supporting militarism and supporting US imperialism. If we're, you know, because I don't think, you know, because if we create a socialist movement that basically just says, like, we're going to get on board with US militarism as long as you give us free healthcare, you know, I feel like, you know, that can lead to political disaster. It can lead to supporting horrific slaughter and
I would just like to, after this is all over, hopefully not in the worst way that many see, I would just like to see 10% of this mobilization for universal health care sometime. Because it's been, and I don't begrudge it, but it's been amazing the energy, the coordination of these protests. And God, you know, this is America. That's their totally their right. I don't like it when they go out to synagogues and JCCs, but if they want to block a bridge, you know, that's freedom, baby, right? That's protest, and they have a right to do that. Is it strange though? I mean, if I came up to you in the street and I said Paraguay has no right to exist, and I've been reading up on Paraguay's history, and we should wipe them out. The Paraguayan entity needs to be wiped out. It's not a legitimate state. 99% of people would be like, "Are you insane? Like,
right, but
what is
that's,
wrong
you
with
know,
you?" So, isn't it strange that the only country, what, with the exception of the Chinese and Taiwan and the Russians and Ukraine, but the only country on a global basis where that kind of talk is legitimate is with
well, I mean, there's the fact that
Jewish country.
the state was created in like 1948.
So is Pakistan.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I mean, you have people who will argue that the partition of Pakistan and India was also a mistake. So, I mean, you know, that is, you know, that is a position that exists.
It's not globally as popular.
Sure, it's not, but I think the Palestinian cause has been able to build an international network of support very effectively over since its inception.
Well,
And
what? Yeah, I'm just saying, like, the UN created it. It's now 75 years later. Like, why do you feel the right to just say, no, we need to undo that?
Well, because first of all, I want to, I want to undo the U.S. government as well. I don't think, I want to get rid of the U.S. Constitution, create a new constitution entirely, reforge the Union entirely, give independence to Puerto Rico, give independence to Hawaii, give Native American nations the right of self-determination. Like, there's really nothing that I argue for with regards to Israel that I don't argue for with regards to my
No,
own country.
you were principled, and that's why you are not some bigot guy. I know you. You're a principled guy. Like, you would apply these principles to other countries. But I'm saying, I mean, isn't true for like the vast majority of people that are basically want to sort of abolish Israel. Like, they don't apply these
Oh, I mean,
principles.
I think you'd have to be, I mean, it's hard to say. Like, I think most people that I work with, do have the same views that I have. And they do apply those principles consistently, I would say. I think a lot of people are just learning about this issue and they see the kind of extreme nationalism, extreme racism, and extreme war crimes and oppression coming out of Israel. And so they see it as like an exceptionally bad state. And you know, I mean, they start reading up on the history of it, and they come to the conclusion that there should be one secular democratic state there instead. That even if we accept the given arrangement of bourgeois nation states, this would still be a better arrangement for human rights, essentially. I obviously take that a little further. I want the whole world system to come crashing down, and I want to build something entirely new out of the ashes.
But
Entirely.
I'm just saying, why is it so? Like, for instance, if we took a poll, for instance, of Americans on the left under the age of 30, and we said, list the top 3 foreign countries you dislike, and then put a number from 1 to 100 on that dislike. I think the results would be number 1, Israel, and it would be like 88, 91.
Right, but what other
Wait,
countries, have tons of our tax dollars going to them and are actively like occupying another people? Because that is like the thing is
I'm
like,
not saying that I'm not saying that it being number 1 is a problem. Okay. I'm saying it's so there's not even like a 2. It's so beyond any dislike they have of any other foreign nation.
well, I think a lot of Americans probably hate Russia more than they hate Israel, for example.
I
Or
mean,
China, for example. I think China probably honestly gets a lot more hate than Israel
did
as well.
anybody say China doesn't have a right to exist?
Yes, I actually have seen people say that China should
Who?
be balkanized, and just various kind of like liberals. I've seen the same argument for Russia, that Russia should be
Okay.
balkanized, and so that is an argument that's
Pretty
been made.
rare, but okay.
There is, so that argument has been made, that these countries should be balkanized, and you know
I really think that the term Nazi is being abused. Would you agree anti-Semitism is a core part of Nazism?
I think yes, but I think when people call Israelis Nazis or call the Israeli government Nazis, they're just kind of referring to like the extremist, like, ethno-chauvinist nationalism and the kind of exterminationist rhetoric. They see that similarity with Nazism. So
Why don't they just call them fascists or
well,
evil?
because, I mean, it's Mussolini style fascism is very chauvinistic and racist, but there's just that exterminationist impulse that people are seeing with a lot of Israelis right now that brings to mind Nazism. I mean,
I see
I see it as well.
I see tweets where people are calling Jews Nazi rats. Does that disturb you?
Well, you listen, like, I don't think people should say anything about Jews in general like that. I don't
Well,
think, you know.
but shouldn't Nazi mean something? Like,
Well, I mean, one thing that was actually funny that I was just reading about is Ben Gurion would refer to like, the Stern Game guys as Nazis. Like, the like the Jabotinsky style like revisionist Zionists, like he would actually call them Nazis, So I feel like there is a history there of even within Zionism of Zionists calling Zionists to their like far right Nazis, for example. So I don't think it's without merit completely. Like I think when
So
people say that term, they're talking about the extremist nationalism and the ethno-chauvinism aspect of it and the exterminationist aspect of it.
I would just ask them, just say fascist, say evil, just pick another term. There's something, I don't know, pretty offensive about calling Jews Nazis, in my opinion, but that's just me. So you've compared Israel
Yeah, I
to
have
Nazi
compared
Germany, and
Netanyahu to
you,
Hitler.
yeah, and you
Yes.
said that the government is pure evil, right?
Yeah, no, I
Okay.
think it's the current government right now is it does seem to me just pure evil based on what they're doing in Gaza and what they've been doing, in the occupied territories and what they've been doing, this kind of surveillance that Palestinian citizens of Israel are put under and the kind of repression and discrimination that they face, I think is not talked about enough, you know.
So
So
this is,
I
yeah,
I
so
do think
they're,
that it's deeply evil, especially the fact that it's like the far right settlers who are kind of leading this government. I
yeah,
do think that it is one of the most extreme nationalist governments in power right now.
yeah, and I see the West Bank and like Gaza quite differently. I think in the West Bank, the Palestinians are within their rights to attack the settlers deep in the West Bank. There's a there's I will make an exception for the settlements right on the border, which are sort of in a more of a gray zone. Okay, East Jerusalem, like for instance, the Wailing Wall is technically in the West Bank, right? That's different. I'm talking about the guys like deep in the West Bank, attacking all of farmers. That's disgusting. And I've been saying
Yeah,
that for years. They need to be arrested, and I'm glad we're sanctioning them. Um, October 7th, that say I've seen Francesca Albanese of the UN, you know her?
yeah,
And this is how she said that Israel should respond. She said it was a crime. Okay, so it's like somebody steals from a shop. It was like a crime like that. And that Israel should have gone into Gaza with warrants and delivered. Here's Sinwar. Here's a letter. You need to show up at The Hague for
show up
your,
at court.
yeah, at your court. That's literally what she said Israel should have done. I think it was that attack was that was a declaration of war, I think.
Right.
And I don't think that justifies Israel to do whatever they want in Gaza, but they took over 200 Israeli hostages, including two babies who are still being kept, um, and old people and small children. Yes, and a lot of IDF troops, which is different. So they have hostages. So it was a defensive war in that sense. There's been tremendous suffering. Over 20,000 civilians have died. Some people will count it that Israel hasn't killed. They'll say they've only killed civilians. I think that's ridiculous. I think they've killed thousands of Hamas fighters during this, but it's definitely over 20,000. It could be more civilians, right? Um, I think it's wrong to compare that to Auschwitz. I don't think the Jews in Auschwitz were holding hostages. I don't think they ever got any ceasefire deals. I don't like that. So what do you think?
Oh, I mean, I think wasn't the argument more that the Gaza Strip is not necessarily a death camp, it's not an extermination camp, but it is a kind of open air prison. It is like kind of like a ghetto. It's an exclusion zone where people are like boxed in and don't have sovereignty. And so I mean I think there is like a case to be made that it is kind of a concentration. Yeah, it is in a way a concentration camp.
But this is not I mean, I see these Nazi analogies. I see people saying Israel is worse than Nazi Germany. I've seen,
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, the Nazis killed like 20 million people, so
but I'm saying,
probably more than
do you
that.
think
So,
that's right to analogize what's going on in Gaza to Auschwitz?
I think any kind of colonial occupation and any kind of war where you have an oppressed people and an oppressor people with like that kind of power over them. I feel like I feel like it is always right to an analyze to make the analogy with Nazism. But I think
It
it's right to make the
isn't.
analogy with other colonial and imperialist atrocities as well. Like
Wait, did you say it is right or it
I think
isn't?
yeah, no, I have no problem with comparing these things to Nazism, but that's because I see
I'm
all of
not
these
saying,
things
I'm
as
saying Auschwitz to say this is
Auschwitz.
Auschwitz.
Well, how like what weren't like 2 million people in total killed in Auschwitz? Like I mean,
I'm just saying, like marching small children into a gas chamber versus bombing a target and unfortunately killing collateral damage. They're both horrible, but I mean, if we can't make distinctions, I, I think there's obviously the huge differences,
right,
right?
but the reality is that the Holocaust didn't start out with the gas chamber. There was an escalation to that point. I'm not saying like inevitably Gaza is going to have gas chambers and that's just going to happen. But the Holocaust begins as ethnic cleansing. It begins as starvation being used as a weapon. It begins with the Commissar order to murder Judeo-Bolshevik commissars to eliminate Judeo-Bolshevism. So, I feel like when people make these kind of analogies, it's to say we need to raise the alarm. There's a sequence of events, that leads to things like the Holocaust. And when we see these kind of things happening, we need to raise the alarm and
Okay.
say never again. We need to, take action to stop this from happening,
Okay. Just it just bothers me because I don't, the Jews in Auschwitz did not hold hostages under the camps.
Yes, but there were,
Yeah.
Jewish, people who joined the partisan units and they committed atrocities on civilians in World War II. I mean,
Yeah, but that's not even why they said they sent them to the camps. It wasn't
sure,
like there
sure,
was
but
this huge
well, the
massacre.
the Nazi propaganda was that the Jews controlled the communists and they did all these atrocities against poor innocent Aryans and there was a lot of
But
that kind of
The Jews were never offered any deals to stop the gas chamber. Like, I don't even know what they would give the Nazis in such a deal. There's
well, before there
scraps
was
of
the gas
food
chambers
or
though there
something.
was they were just the plan was to deport the Jews and just send them off to Madagascar, for example, is one location. I mean, even at one point they even considered Palestine with the Havara agreement. That kind of fell apart for, I mean, you know, that was a bit too far for them both, but it starts with, the Holocaust started as ethnic cleansing to create, living space for the German people, like a Lebensraum or whatever. So, I
But
think
the people running the war cabinet, here's my question. Do you know who's excluded from the war cabinet in the Israeli
isn't
government?
is you referring to Ben Gvir?
Both of them are, yes, Smotrich and Ben
All
Gvir
right.
both explicitly excluded, and they brought in Benny Gantz and Eisenkot, who are sort of centrist politicians. They're not even allowed to come to the war cabinet. So, uh,
Right, but I mean, we're talking about like a broader military culture within the IDF that has evolved from years of like policing and the Arabs and dehumanizing them. So, I think you can point to the fact, yes, the top brass are not the most extreme people in Israel, but if you look at the middle managers in the IDF and
I
you know,
don't think the explicit goal is to kill everybody, to starve everybody, to.
right, but that's the truth is that, genocides don't always begin that way. They don't always begin with an explicit, order to kill everybody. It begins with we need to kick these people out of this land. and then take over their land and ethnically cleanse it.
See,
Wait,
that's
we're not having
ethnically
success with that. Let's
that's
start putting them
ethnic
all in.
that's ethnic cleansing, and I've always said I
Right,
can
but ethnic
see a
cleansing can
case.
escalate into genocide.
Right. Well,
It can
I
then
know, but
escalate into extermination, and sometimes they go hand in hand. And so whenever you have a risk of ethnic cleansing, you have a risk of genocide.
so what do you think's going to happen? I think I see some approaching sort of red lines for Biden. One is July, when I I don't think it takes a historian to see the potential perils of this
Yeah.
still going on in July when we have a
Yeah.
Democratic convention in Chicago. I
Yep.
think we can all see what that would be like. I don't think that Biden will, I think he does not want that.
Right.
Do you
No,
have
I
any,
think Biden wants to get this over with, but he's also afraid of, of actually doing, not because I think Biden is like a humanitarian. Like I think like Biden has said some pretty vile things about like Palestinians in the past, actually. Like he actually has shown like willingness to like, support Israel, like facilitating the massacre of civilians with Sabra and Shatila, actually. But Biden, he realizes it's a political liability. He'd like for it to be over. But is he actually going to do what it would take? I don't know. I would like him to, because, that would mean that all of us who've been marching in the streets demanding action and demanding, you know, that he cut the check or stop, cutting the check to Israel and apply pressure on him would have been successful in pressuring him, and that would have shown a successful movement, you know? So I want that to happen, obviously, but I'm worried that the US is too afraid to alienate Israel as its ally in the Middle East. I think
uh,
Israel also has political influence in the US. I think ultimately the US is the more powerful. I don't think that APAC runs the US or whatever. Like, but I do think the US is the more powerful, partner here, and that we ultimately hold the greater power. But I do think that Israel does put a lot of effort into influencing American politics, and you know, just as any country that wants US support would do.
yeah. Oh, I forgot to ask this, but if you believe it's a genocide, here's my question, because I don't understand this. If you think it's a genocide, when Hamas has now refused multiple ceasefire deals,
Right.
shouldn't there be real anger at them after
Well,
they
I mean, I
reject
feel like,
this?
when you look at the details of the ceasefire agreements that Hamas has refused, though, I mean, you can't really blame them for refusing them, because in a lot of, like, for example, I mentioned Sabra and Shatila like a couple of minutes ago, where the PLO, they made an agreement with Israel that they would leave Lebanon, you know, and that Israel would allow them to peacefully withdraw. And when that happened, you had massacres of refugee camps in Lebanon of Palestinians. And so I think that Hamas, they want, a permanent ceasefire is what they've been saying. They don't want just like a temporary ceasefire, and they want guarantees that that won't happen again. So I think, there is a worry that, Hamas, if they sign on to a bad deal, it could be even worse for the Palestinians.
Well, if it's a real genocide, why isn't this position just release the babies? Why are you holding these babies in a dungeon? Release them, release the hostages, so that, I mean, if they released all the hostages,
Oh, haven't they made agreements? There have been
they
prison
did one.
exchanges.
They did one previous, but why just release all of them?
Well, because it just doesn't make strategic sense to
Well, but if
give
it's
out your
a,
hostages without getting anything in return. Like, it just
but
shows weakness.
see, that's why I wonder if genocide is the right word. And I open brutal war, ethnic cleansing, whatever. But when it's a genocide, like for instance, even in 1944, if there was a headline in the New York Times, Auschwitz Jews refuse deal to shut down the gas chambers. And let's say, I don't even know what it would be. They refuse it because there's not enough sundaes and I don't know, not enough ice cream in the deal or something like that. Could you imagine how angry American Jews would be at them?
Well, I mean, it'd be more like if Soviet partisans like refused like a ceasefire deal with the Nazis because they were worried that there weren't like protection for a bunch of Jews and other like refugees who were in like camps that they were defending, that they would have protection or something like that. Like it's
But if it was what I'm saying, the Jews would be furious. Just take the deal, stop the gas chamber, stop the genocide immediately. But
right, but there's also like a sense of like I said, there's a sense that like a shitty ceasefire deal could just be worse for the Palestinians because in their national memory, similar things like that have happened. Like there have been agreements that they have made agreements like that with Israel that have resulted in massacres in refugee camps. So, there's, like I said, like there is a
Right.
fear that like if they don't agree to a proper deal, like a real deal with like real guarantees that the ceasefire will last, that, it will just be a way for Israel to get away with worse atrocities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a simple mind, I guess. So, like, my understanding of genocide, I think that what's going on is there's two definitions of genocide. There's sort of the old one, which was an army goes into a territory and says, just wipe them out, just kill men, women, children, line them up against the wall, shoot them all, put them in a mass grave, drive all the Armenians into the desert without food. And now I guess there's a new definition of genocide that's includes delivering aid trucks to people. And maybe that's the new definition is better. It's a little murky, and then we get to the thing where people are saying that there's a genocide in Haiti and
Yeah, I mean, I obviously,
Right.
I think, the claim
Right.
that there's a genocide in Haiti, like
Right,
that's
right.
nonsense, obviously. But I think
Right.
with Israel, with Gaza, I think there is a concerted effort to make the Gaza Strip unlivable.
Right.
And that, in my opinion, is a kind of like systemic exterminationism that merits the term genocide.
Herbicide is interesting. I think blowing up the universities, there's a interesting case about that. Yeah. No, I think there are other words but
The thing is, though, is listen, like your argument is kind of that it's not as bad as Auschwitz, so it can't be a genocide. But the thing is like the Rwandan genocide didn't have gas chambers, but
no,
it was
I'm not saying it has to have gas chambers. I
right.
mean, they drove the Armenians into a desert with no food, no
Right,
water.
but the thing
Yeah.
is like you have like talk about doing that to the Palestinians and driving them into the Sinai desert,
Right.
So,
Right.
I feel like it merits that
Right.
label because that's the kind
Mhm.
of level we're at right now.
Right.
I think, you can be, a liberal Israeli who
Right.
thinks, there should be a two-state solution, but think that this government is right now committing a genocide. I mean,
Right.
it is possible to have that belief.
Do you think October 7th was a mistake on the part of Hamas?
It's too soon to tell, I think. It's too soon to tell. I like to wait. I like to let history
Right.
judge a little bit, and I think it could be. I think what the reality is that on the ground there was a sense that there was a stasis. There was a kind of a sense that the existing status quo couldn't last any longer. That something had to change. That the situation for the Palestinians was getting so desperate and so, you know, it just, the situation in the West Bank. I mean, I know people who have relatives there and they've told me things that have just been terrifying.
Tell me about that if you don't mind.
Well, you know, one story that's always stuck with me is, this young man wanted to go out for a night and just you know, hang out with his friends, go out, drive around, party or whatever. So he gets out of his house, driving on the road, and right in the middle of the road, there's a settler with a gun and starts shooting at him, shooting at his car. Luckily, he misses and runs out of bullets, but this guy, he's got to, drive away from this and, you know, didn't leave his house for 7 months after that because he was so scared. He just wants to go out and have a good time with his friends like, anyone does, growing up. And that's the kind of shit he has to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I say this in my interviews with people on this subject, no matter who. This whole Israeli argument that there's this woman, Annette Wilf, who makes this a lot. We've been reaching out to the Palestinians for peace, and they just keep rejecting it. And it's like that doesn't work after you've been doing settlement expansion for
Right,
all
right.
these years. That's not reaching out for peace. Like that argument does not hold water anymore.
Yeah. Well,
And,
that but
and
that's kind of
yeah,
the whole flaw of the Oslo Accords was that they didn't stop building the settlements. The idea was to like get the Palestinians into these negotiations and get them to agree to like become like a subcontractor security force while we continue to build settlements and like act like nothing's changed for us. But now they have to change, but we don't have to change. We can keep building settlements.
was
We
that part
keep
of those deals? They could keep building settlements.
Well, they weren't, they didn't, the Palestinians, I don't think they ever agreed to that, but they kept doing it anyway. Like Rashid Khalidi's book talks about it actually. He has the chapter where he talks about Oslo and all that stuff is really good. He explains like kind of, because he was at the Madrid Peace Conference as well. And he kind of, he had his firsthand perspective of how all this went down. And his argument is basically that like Oslo made life worse for the Palestinians on the ground. And he was fine with a two-state solution. He just didn't like the way that they went about doing it. Like he
Yeah,
thought the whole framework of Oslo was very flawed, and the way that it like turned the PA into this subcontractor for Israel was essentially designed to kind of screw over the Palestinians. And so, he thinks that, it was kind of a mistake to, enter the framework they did, but, he wasn't against any kind of negotiation for a two-state solution.
if I told you that Hitler figure was going to be elected president in 2040, okay, would you still be putting so much energy into basically abolishing a Jewish safe
I
haven?
mean, I would be putting my energy into stopping the Hitler guy from getting elected in 2040. Right?
But okay, so then I'll rephrase it. I know a lot of people quibble, and I understand the thing. The ADL counts free. They'll count somebody saying free Gaza as anti-Semitism. I get it. I've spoken to the experts. There has been a increase in anti-Semitism. I mean, would you deny that?
No, I mean, I think it was increasing before October 7th, even.
Yeah. Right.
Like, you had, like, the whole Kanye West bullshit.
Right. But
Like,
it's been increasing. Isn't it a bit crazy? I mean, with it increasing to be so devoted to
well, here's the
making sure.
thing, is that if there's a new Hitler figure, it's not just Jews that are going to be persecuted. Like, it's going to be sexual minorities, like transgender people. It's going to be other racial minorities, anyone who's, brown skinned or from like third world countries.
That's not what the Groypers believe. They want to unite everybody in killing the Jews.
Yeah, but the Groypers are a fringe movement.
That might be the form it takes. I'm saying, does anything, if you did abolish Israel, do you have any fear that you would feel guilty if there was some type of Hitler figure that rose up and the Jews have nowhere to go?
I would obviously, if that kind of situation happened, I would have already had put all of my effort into stopping that from happening and in helping, Jewish people fight back, helping, anyone who's victimized by this like new fascist regime fight back. And the way I look at it is like this whole idea that like, well, if Hitler comes into power, at least there's a place where the Jews can go, But what about all the other groups that would be targeted by this potential new Hitler? What if, the new Hitler isn't going after Jews? What if they're, say transgender people are the new minority that they want to exterminate? Do we need, do they need their own state that they can flee to? I feel like the solution
the
is
trans
to
thing
be
is
fascist.
a little different, but it's interesting you say that because Brianna Joy Gray was posting, where do I get my country? I think she's referring to being black.
Oh, yeah, that's
There
obviously.
are a lot of black countries. In fact, Ghana will let American black people become citizens.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not the same for Jews. I mean, there's only
But the thing is I don't think most American Jews would want to flee to Israel. I think they would rather stay and fight against fascism, you know. I feel like they see themselves as Americans and
well, it might
you
get
know,
to a point where they have to do that for their lives. As crazy as that is to imagine, it's happened before. But I've been thinking about that, and in Chicago, for instance, there was some kind of screening of a documentary about the Nova Music Festival that was attacked on October 7th.
right.
And these anti-Israel, pro-Palestine people protested it. Even this Jewish guy was assaulted trying to enter it, apparently. There was that, and then I was thinking, just a few weeks previous, Kanye West did a performance at the United Center in Chicago. Not one protest, not one flyer. He just was at a major music festival. No one cared.
Yeah.
I don't see much evidence of this resistance. I mean, first of all, why are they protesting something on the Nova Music Festival?
Oh, I think probably because they see it as war propaganda. You know,
And
like when people were tearing down like the posters of the hostages, I mean, yeah, it's bad, it looks bad, but I think it's because they see it as war propaganda. It's like this is Israel manufacturing consent for their war, you know, so screw them, we're gonna protest them. You know, I mean, it's ugly, but I think that's the logic there, and I can't entirely disagree. I think it is war propaganda, like.
so let's say a survivor of the Nova massacre gave a talk near you. Would you protest it?
Um, Honestly, I would probably just go just to see what it was like, and I would maybe ask some difficult questions, but I wouldn't probably protest it, you know. Just because I mean it's, you know, depends, I guess. It depends what the theme of the event is, either if it's like a support the IDF type thing and listen to this speaker, survivor from the Nova Music Festival, and it's kind of like he's going to talk or she's going to talk and explain why the IDF needs to destroy Hamas in Gaza, blah, blah, blah. And I think it would be fair target for protests, actually, because at that point, it's just pro-IDF propaganda.
Okay.
So it's always in the details for me. You got to look at the details and see what exactly is going on every time, in my opinion.
Norm Finkelstein has said that Israel has committed genocide, I believe, against the Palestinians 4 times since 1982. Yet over that time, let's just exclude everything in the last 5 months. But from 1982, he says 4 genocides. The population of Palestine went up.
So wait, what are the 4 instances of genocide in his
You'd
opinion?
have to
Like,
ask him. But he said
okay.
4
So
but I'm saying, how does a population go up after 4 genocides?
I mean, listen, I don't know what Norm is responding to or is referencing to there. I mean, but I think you know, the argument is that there is a denial of Palestinian nationality and a systemic violent occupation to deny this nation any kind of national existence beyond the most basic meager national existence. And so I think that's what he's arguing there for. And he's like, yes, the population has grown, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a relation of subjugation and you know, or a fear of that demographic in Israeli
Yeah.
society.
I
There is
mean,
a
but
fear
there
of
are other words besides I mean, for instance, I think the Jewish population on Earth just became what it was before the Holocaust. Now,
right,
like 70 plus years later.
right. Like when I think when talking about genocide, I'm specifically talking about the war in Gaza right now.
Right. No, yeah, yeah. I'm just
But
saying, like, I looked up, somebody was tweeting, this guy Jason Rosenberg was tweeting about there was a genocide in 2021. And I mean, I don't know. I worry about these words just becoming meaningless. But I don't know. I think you make a good point. So let's talk about the movement. I think you guys are doing great. I mean, you guys are winning. The Chinese government appears to really like you guys with TikTok. No, I think they really are using
Oh no, I mean,
TikTok,
hey,
but
you know, I'm not gonna
we'll
complain if
take
they
it.
are.
I mean, but it is a little scary. I
I don't
see.
think the Chinese government gives a shit about like spreading any kind of revolutionary ideas in the United
I
States.
think they really like spreading like this kind of Jewish conspiracy theory stuff. I was just I don't know if you know these streamers, the Vanguard. Do you know them?
The Vanguard. Hold on.
Vanguard. They're like two young streamers.
I don't know if I know them.
There's this clip, and they're like very much the TikTok generation, but it is a bit alarming, like these conspiracy theory things. Okay, I'll play this. So this is the Vanguard. They're like Bernie supporters. They'll have on like Kyle Kalinske and stuff.
Start Bad Boy Records. Your mafia connected to Biggie Smalls. That's how he had risen to fame. And as a 24-year-old, he gets staked by this billionaire to start Bad Boy Records. Let's see. I want to get the billionaire's name right. It was founded by Diddy, and it says P Diddy on the thing, but there was like, I don't want to sound crazy, but like there was an Israeli billionaire that fucking helped him finance it. Okay, I don't want to find that gentleman's name, so I don't just sound like I'm like spouting it off. But if you go to Bad Boy Records, there's no mention of that guy. But anyway, that you can find out. That's how he got bankrolled for Bad Boy Records. Then he basically, people assume through a web of always having every room in his house, under surveillance, right? He was able to acquire blackmail on individuals. He would get them to engage in like homosexual sex acts, and then film that, and then use that as leverage against them. Because especially in the 90s, but even until this point today, hip hop has been incredibly homophobic. It was incredibly damaging to your career as a rapper if you're seen as like soft or homosexual. Like you remember when homosexual, like I'm a fucking old man from the 70s, but like fucking gay guys. Like you remember when Migos was talking all that shit back in the day on like I Love McConan, and then everybody was like, oh, this is awkward. Yeah, so that was all going on in the background, and that's why you have guys like Meek Mill, and a lot of people expect Usher was one of the other unnamed individuals in this dude, and that's why Meek Mill came out and was like, I love fucking pussy. Sometimes all you guys' favorites and all that shit. Sometimes more than one, etc. So this is a lot of information that I'm spitting at you guys. But anyway, this is the background information that you need to have. And yes, you can Google all of this shit. And yes, it is 100% true. And the elephant in the room is that this is all, backed up by Mossad. And it was let slide by the United States alphabet agencies. Because why? Because it was going to feed the for-profit prison system with the gangster rap lifestyle. Like, I honestly, it does seem like the kind of thing historically the CIA would have done. How did Diddy by himself learn how to, create a black, male scheme of mass surveillance, right? Clearly he had some assistance. And then there's just too many like weird coincidences, like the guy getting the LAPD to leave and calling it a drive-by when very clear, obviously.
So I just play that because I'm seeing a lot of this from these like TikTok kids. It's like I mean, to reiterate what he was saying is the Mossad, this is what he says the Mossad was doing in the late 90s. They were blackmailing Usher to create gangster rap to help the for-profit prison industry for some reason.
I mean, I'm open-minded towards conspiracy theories somewhat, like I'm willing to, listen, there obviously in history there have been conspiracies that have been exposed, but that sounds ridiculous to me. But
yeah, I think they are doing something with TikTok. But let's talk about your movement. So how close do you think you are to the goal of ending Israel?
I mean, I wouldn't say that that's my specific goal. I think my general goal of, world revolution and world communism or whatever, I think that's just, it's kind of part of what's going to happen in general. It's, there's going to be revolution in the Middle East, and there's going to be some kind of democratic solution to the issue of Zionism that hopefully will, not be ugly, will be as non-ugly as possible. But I think right now, the legitimacy of the Zionist project is in crisis right now. I think it was probably closer to the defeat of Zionism than we've ever been, because I think it's just putting itself, the state of Israel is just putting itself in such a position right now where it claims to be part of this international rules-based order, yet it so clearly is acting and without any regard for that rules-based order. So it creates creating like an ideological crisis for the US, because we claim to be the upholders of humanitarian norms in the global world order, yet we're backing this state that is clearly not following these kind
Wait,
of
what do you mean? But they were attacked. October 7th can fairly be looked at as an act of war
Sure.
against the governing from the governing body of Gaza, and now they have initiated a military operation. So, yeah, I don't really see that analogy to like Russia going into Ukraine.
Well, it's different. Yeah, I mean it's not the same as Russia going into Ukraine. It's a very different situation. A lot of people will make comparisons on both sides of it. Some people will compare, Ukraine to the Palestinians. Pro-Russia, pro-Palestinian people will say that the Donbass Russians who want to separate from Ukraine are like the Palestinians. So, I don't really buy either of those. I think it's two very different conflicts of different different things are at stake right there.
But the goal is the thinking, this is what I presume, is once we can get America to turn against Israel, then it's over for Israel, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. I mean, it's over at least for Israel as it exists right now,
Okay.
as this hyper-militarized police power in the Middle East that is able to occupy territory and dispossess Palestinians.
What do you think of calling Zionists the new Nazis?
I mean, we already went over this, didn't we?
Okay. So wait,
Yeah, I mean, I
no,
think
but I'm saying the Zionists, the individual. So like, oh, my neighbor's a Zionist. Should he be treated like a Nazi?
I mean, if they talk like a Nazi, if they say, "I wish, we could just,
No, they just say, I think Jews in danger should have a place to go, and
yeah, I don't say that itself makes you. If you, my approach is, if you talk like a Nazi, I'll call you a Nazi. Like, and I live in MAGA territory, and we have like a lot of these like pro-Trump Zionists around where I live, and they talk like Nazis, to be quite frank. So
I just the thing that bothers me about the Zionism is the new Nazism is if you really believe this, it's like the Tree of Life massacre. If you believe this, that was really just a dispute between Nazi subgroups. It wasn't a Nazi going in and killing a bunch of innocent Jews trying to worship. Like it was one Nazi killing other Nazis. You know what I mean? Like,
I
doesn't
mean,
that
but I don't
seem
think the
wrong?
Tree of Life massacre had anything to do with
No,
Zionism.
but I'm certain all the victims were Zionists.
Yeah, they were probably, varying shades of Zionists, but I don't think that
They
I
weren't
feel
Nazis.
they were massacred because they were Jews.
But
Obviously,
were
they were
they
all massacred because
Nazis?
they were Zionists, or if that
But
would.
were they Nazis?
I mean, I highly doubt they were. I mean, wasn't that synagogue that was attacked? Weren't they like working with Muslim refugees and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
But
I mean,
they probably believed in the state of Israel. Anyways, I think that would be ridiculous to just call anyone who supports Israel a Nazi, but I see what you mean. If they're saying like, let's wipe out the Palestinians.
right. Like
Okay, I
I
see what you're
think
saying.
I feel like there is a kind of a crusader type aspect to the war in Gaza right now.
Okay.
Like the way that, they're going in there and putting up like these menorahs and like adding all
That
this
was
religious
horrible.
symbolism and stuff. Like it reminds
Horrible.
me of the Crusades almost. Like it comes off as like we're conquering this land in the name of our religion to make it Jewish land.
Yeah. No, that was horrible. The menorah thing was outrageous.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're even letting them post to TikTok is insane. And making these videos, ooh, look how cool we look blowing up this whatever it is, a tunnel or something.
Right, but the thing
It's
is
horrible.
like it feels
Yeah.
like if Nazis were like around, like if TikTok was around when Nazis are around, they would be posting crazy stuff like that, of
Well,
like them like
what
bragging about blowing stuff up and you know, that kind of stuff. Like it's just the way that the IDF is acting in Gaza right now. It brings up these images of the kind of depravity
Right.
you would hear about
Right.
in
But
World War II.
a lot of them would say, my friend was killed by Hamas, you know, and we don't, what they say a lot, and it is sort of scary, but you have to understand is they fought these wars before where they just do these minor things in Gaza, and they call them rounds, and they're just like, we don't want to do this anymore. I understand that does sound dangerous,
Right,
but
that's,
that's where but it's about that's why they have this idea of Hamas has to go, not the idea, you can't get rid of that, but like Sinwar, they all have to either go in exile or be killed because they don't want
right.
to do this. They don't want to have another war in Gaza.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, they want, but that brings up like the danger that they want like
Right.
a final solution.
That is
You know?
yes, that is dangerous. I don't think they
Which is, you know, why people bring
yeah,
this is why that
right.
specter of
Do you
Nazism kind of gets brought up is when you it's like
right,
when you hear people talking like this, it
right,
really like brings to mind like those horrors of the 20th century that,
right.
you know, we
Yeah. Do you think they will resettle Gaza with Jewish communities?
I
Let me
hope
put
they
that.
don't, you know, I really hope they don't, but I've seen things that kind of point in that direction. So,
But if you had to put your money on it, do you think
I
so?
mean, I'm not a gambling man, you know,
Okay.
I can see them going in that direction.
Okay.
Yes. I think that there are forces in Israel that want to make that happen. And I think that they were the way that the government seems to be acting right now is just like we don't give a fuck what the international opinion is. Like we're gonna do what we want and you can't stop us.
So the goal is eventually America turns against Israel, and then it's like sanctions, blockade. Is
I
that
mean, if that's what it takes to end the
okay?
occupation, yeah.
What is that? So end the occupation. What is
Um, Withdrawal from the West Bank
okay?
and East Jerusalem and the blockade of Gaza. Um,
Well, what about if they
Initiate dialogue on the refugee question. You don't have to immediately do right of return, but
yeah.
initiate a dialogue of reconciliation at the very least.
But
I
if
think.
Hamas is still, if some group like that is still in power, can you really say like you need to allow them to import missiles from Iran?
Oh, I think if you didn't have the occupation and you didn't have you know all this stuff, there wouldn't be a militant Hamas trying to get missiles from Iran to fire at Israel. Like I feel you have to address the root of the issue, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. So I think you guys are, it's interesting. So just here's my position. I think Israel, a Jewish safe haven, I think it's really important. I think young Jews, a lot that are embracing anti-Zionism, they don't know what a world without Israel would be like. And I don't think it's too scary to imagine they could ever need it in America. But I think the young generation is so anti-Israel. I think that my message to Israelis is you should only count on 20, maybe 15 to 20 more years of a strong U.S. alliance.
Right. Yeah, I
Don't,
definitely see that. I definitely think the strong U.S.
and I would
alliance.
actually advise, it's funny, I would advise you guys you should be for Israel aid because it makes Israel so weak. I mean, look at this. They're not even making their own munitions. You really don't. I am for cutting off all the aid because I think it's like heroin. I think they need to make all of their own munitions. It's ridiculous. They become way too dependent on America. Um, you should support aid. You keep them weak, right?
I think that without U.S. aid, it's not just U.S. aid, but also diplomatic backing.
That's different.
But
That's
also it's the technology. Like the Iron Dome, for example, relies on US technology. Like a lot of the weapon systems that they're using rely on US technology. So if they lost US aid, they'd have to like totally redesign their weapon systems. They would have to find like new weapon manufacturing partners and stuff. I mean, it would put them in a really difficult spot. And so it would put them in a spot where at the very least they have to start recognizing Palestinian demands. And that's really what I want is I want Palestinian demands to be recognized, and wherever that leads things to go, I support.
Well,
Ideally,
I support that too. I support that too. I think what I was going to say is they should do this deal with the Palestinians or whatever while the alliance with America is strong. They'll get better terms about a demilitarized Palestinian state, stuff like that, if they do it sometime in the future. And I think he's such a horrible ambassador. He's just destroyed the relationship with the Democrats. And I would say get rid of all the settlements, make real overtures for peace. The problem is that you have Iran there who does want to wipe out Israel. And so the Israelis look at any independent Palestinian state and they're just like, Iran's going to give them weapons. And another problem, I'm not sure, are you aware that the West Bank is sort of above the main population area of Israel?
you mean like
They sort of
population
look
size?
down on where most of the population is. So if they had like sophisticated rockets, they could wipe out like the main population centers. There's a major fear of that. That's really is going to be the problem, is that the weapons stuff.
The way I look at it is, like I said earlier, if you want
Yeah.
to create peace and cooperation, you need to
Get
create
rid
the
of it.
economic foundations for it, which is why I think you need socialist policies to do economic redistribution, to create kind of economic conditions where, people can generally like cooperate economically, and from there you can get more peaceful arrangements, I think. So I
Right.
think
Iran, they execute gay people. Are you like them?
no,
The
I
government.
don't. I actually don't like the government of
Okay.
Iran.
All right.
I have a friend, Yasmin Mather, who was a guerrilla fighter against the Ayatollah in the 1980s. She's a communist. Iran executed thousands of communists in the 1980s. They massacre trade unionists today. They persecute sexual minorities and women,
What
obviously.
about Hezbollah though?
I think Hezbollah is, a resistance movement against Israeli occupation of Lebanon. I don't agree with their ideology or with Iran, but I do understand that it is, they come out of a national resistance to an occupation of Israel. But so it's complicated in that sense, because I don't like the Iranian government. You know, I get shit from some of the more I guess tanky quote unquote left for not really liking Iran.
What if but what
Like
I'm
when those
saying,
protests broke out
right.
in Iran, I was weary of CIA interference and subversion, but I was also supportive of people in Iran striking for women's rights, so I'm not a fan of the Iranian government.
do you ever wonder if the axis of resistance I mean, can you imagine raising kids right across from these Hezbollah rockets, the fear, Hamas, the Houthis, the Hezbollah? I know they're taking action, but do you ever wonder if maybe instead it was more moderate people that would deprive Israel of excuses and maybe get to a better outcome, or no?
Well, because I think the extremism is a response to Israel's actions, I think. So yeah, maybe if, there was less of that kind of like revanchist talk and less kind of like, maybe there would be a different attitude, but it's like we don't live in the ideal world. Like we live in a world where
Mm-hmm.
people take up arms for their homelands, and from there things escalate.
So do you want Hamas to survive as the governing body in Gaza after all this?
I think that the people of Gaza have a right to choose Hamas as their government. I personally wouldn't vote for Hamas. I would probably vote for like DFLP.
Well, they haven't allowed elections and
Right. But at the same time, like, I think Hamas has actually entertained the possibility of forming a new PLO, a new Palestinian Unified National Movement. I would support that because I think it would be good to overcome some of the sectarianism and division in the Palestinian movement. I think that that would actually weaken the Islamist influence and increase the more secular and even Marxist aspects of Palestinian nationalism. So I think that Hamas has to be recognized as a part of the Palestinian national movement. I think that it is, you know, it's not my favorite part. I'm not an Islamist, obviously. I don't really like Islamism, I'm a secular guy, I'm an atheist, I like secular politics. I don't like clericalism of
I'm sure you don't like that the protocols of the Elders of Zion are cited in their original
Sure, yeah, I
charter,
mean, to the
yeah.
extent that the first charter is still relevant, I don't know how much it is,
Right.
But yeah, obviously, there's undeniable anti-Semitism in the
Yeah,
Hamas
right.
charter. That's,
So do you have any optimism for on the ground there that after all this
Yeah, I think,
horrible-
like I said, I think the idea of unity amongst the Palestinian
Yeah.
factions is gaining popularity, and I think that's promising in my opinion. I think if the unity amongst the Palestinian factions, I think, can show a greater kind of focus and making demands and coming to coming to some kind of national consensus and coming to a unified strategy for Palestinians. I think despite the disaster and the horrors that have been inflicted upon Gaza, I think if that results from all of this, I think that would be a positive. And so,
if the Israelis gave them a Palestinian state, do you think they would attack Israel within 5 to 10 years?
depends how Israel acts. It really depends on what happens from there.
Well,
First of
let's
all,
say Israel doesn't attack them.
well, let's say, is the Palestinian state just an Indian reservation, essentially? Like, what kind of state is it? Do they have real sovereignty?
Well, what do you mean? Do they get an air force on day one?
Well, I think ultimately, like, yeah, I feel like if you have sovereignty, you have to be able to have an armed forces to some degree, right? Like,
but on day one,
I mean, I think, it would be hard to raise an air force on day one, but
I think the question is, the idea has always been about trust building and reaching certain things and increasing the military capacity. But
right, but like, I just don't think it's fair for Israel to have nukes, but for a Palestinian state to like have to be totally demilitarized. Like, it just doesn't seem fair.
But what do you think they would attack Israel
Um,
within 10 years?
it depends on what Israel does in the meantime,
Oh, let's just say Israel doesn't attack them, just goes.
No, I don't think they would. No, I think if Israel, didn't attack them, respected their sovereignty, and you know, and I don't think there would be war. I think there could be tensions. There could be there'd probably be like arguing over the right of return and stuff like that, and there probably would be, communication between Palestinians who are Israeli citizens and Palestinians and the new state that would create, anxieties for Israel as well. That's one thing I think that makes the case for a one-state solution is, let's say a new Palestinian state gets created, and, like, the Palestinians who still live in Israel are going to want to have connections with them, right? So, I mean, it does make sense to at least have some kind of confederation. Like,
Palestinians. I mean, so the Israeli right wingers will say they don't want a Palestinian state as an end state. That's why they don't. All they hold up at rallies are a thief can never become a owner or something, and they just see it as a temporary thing to attack Israel to conquer Tel Aviv. You
Right.
know Palestinians. Is that true, or what do you think?
I would say that they don't want to give up right of return. That's the one thing I think what they would say is, we don't want to give up right of return. And I think that that doesn't mean that we have to like get the right of return by invading Israel. I think that it's, there's other means to address that issue. Like I said, the Palestinian population in Israel could advocate for it and work with Palestinians there. But so I mean, and I know a lot of different Palestinians who have different opinions on these things. So it's hard for me to like speak for them, of course. But
Yeah.
like generally the Palestinians I know, like they support right of return and they prefer a one-state solution. But right now their focus is getting a ceasefire and getting aid to Gaza.
And what did they say to you about the do they want to expel Jews after that one state, or
No, the one Palestinian guy I know actually he addressed this. He said it's like there's I think 6 million Jews living in Israel, and there's I think 6 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and then 1 million Palestinians who live in Israel. So, those 6 million Jews aren't going anywhere. They're not going to leave. This is also their home at this point. But those 7 million Palestinians, they're not going to leave either. They're not going anywhere.
right?
So, and he says sometimes, I'll talk to more extreme Palestinians and I'll have to tell them that, but
So finally, looking forward, how confident is Israel's time's up? Is it just a ticking clock? Have you got the youth on your team, or how confident do you feel?
I feel confident that the honeymoon with the US is coming to an end, and that Israel is at the very least going to have to start recognizing Palestinian demands and accepting, I think Israel in its current form at the very least will be changing. And I think the possibility of a right of return and a just democratic settlement is there. I think it's there, but I definitely think Israel in its current form is going to have to change soon. But it doesn't mean like one state from the river to the sea is going to happen anytime soon, but I do think we are going to see a different status quo in the Middle East in that region soon. And I think if that happens, and I think, if you could make the case that October 7th was worth it from a strategic perspective because it broke the existing status quo and, changed the situation. But
Yeah, I mean, there are now, and I will applaud your movement on the sanctions on the settlers. That's new. That's probably because of your guys' act.
well, yeah, no, Biden has had
Yeah.
to make like, concessions
Yeah.
because of the popular movement for Palestine.
And
So
that's really good. And it actually is having a big effect on their bank accounts. And there's even an article that might break the settler movement. And I applaud that. And just to wrap it up, I want to say there's horrible suffering in Gaza. And I don't take joy in anything that's happened in the last 5 months. And I would like to see peaceful coexistence and the end of these settlement expansion. And I understand. And they have every right to look at what Israel has been doing for the last 20 years in the West Bank as just eating away their homeland slowly. And I get it. And so I guess we aren't as far apart as we might have thought. So thank you, Donald. As usual, you're a very reasonable guy. And thank you for speaking to me, man.
yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad to have come on and made the case for the anti-Zionist perspective. I think some people said I shouldn't have done this, because, if, you're not supposed to talk to anyone who's, at all right wing towards relative to yourself on any issue or whatever. So obviously, we have differences, very intense differences in some cases, but, we can still have a respectful discussion about this. So
Yeah, I think it proves that Twitter makes everything, you know, it just naturally happens. We just start to see the other side as the, you know, not.
Yeah, I
not
mean, listen,
picking the worst.
I
Yeah.
live in MAGA country.
Right.
I have to talk to Trump supporters who believe in QAnon or whatever, you know. So you know, I'm willing to talk to people who disagree with me on all kinds of things, you know. And so, you know,
No, you're very. I've always noted. You're a very talented debater. You're very no offense, sort of monotone, very calm. You're very calm, and it's like a judo move. It's like rather than screaming, you win the debate by being quiet. But
well, you know, I feel
yeah.
like, you know, I just try to be reasonable. I try to say it like you know, I say it like I think it, but I don't try to like be overly like hostile and antagonistic.
Oh, one last thing: who's going to win, Trump or Biden?
Oh God, I think, you know, I'm preparing for Trump to win. I'm kind of you know,
And he's
I don't know.
fucking broke. So literally he's going to be bribed this time. Like,
I think you know, maybe Biden will win. It's a bit too soon to say, you know. But you know, I'm worried either way, no matter who wins, that there's going to be more repression of the left and that things are going to get worse no matter what.
yeah.
That's kind of my perspective.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't vote for Biden last election and I don't regret that.
Yeah, in future we got to discuss how to, because I realize I made it as a criticism, not as a criticism, but I've been pointing out, why haven't we seen these protests for universal health care like this at all? And I think I know the answer is because it's sort of because of this stupid system. You gotta get 60, but we gotta figure out a way to do something, you know, like to have some kind of movement like that.
Yeah, no, I think, you
Yeah.
know, I'd like to keep building up the DSA, but I think you know, the labor movement in general needs to build itself up. I think you know, unions are important, especially, you know, I think we need to build up the labor movement and build, you know, so that's how you're going to win universal health care.
Do you like Sean Fain?
You know, I have mixed opinions on him. I think he's done some good things, but I think he's also a bit too close with Biden at times. You know, I'm always been weary of union leaders collaborating with the state. You know, I think.
But he's an improvement, probably, right?
Yeah, you know, he's an
Yeah.
improvement in the
Yeah.
UAW for sure. You know, I have friends who are in the UAW who voted for him.
All right, man. Thank you so much, dude.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for
see you
having me
later.
on, and I hope I made a good case for
I think you
anti-Zionism.
did. I think you did.